LoveLore Library. Chapter 311. Yili dismounted her horse and raised her hand. General Liu, there's no need to be so courteous. This is the vice commander of the Western Expedition, Marquis Nan. This is Marquis Muyang's heir, Lieutenant Muyang. Yili didn't introduce Shui Jing, Yun Ting, and the others standing behind her. The generals understood that they were on the same side and only went forward to greet Marquis Nan and Muyang. Marquis Nan was someone who had been on the battlefield and naturally didn't care about the trifles in front of these generals. He very straightforwardly greeted everyone. As for Muyang, although he had the status of Marquis Muyang's heir, his position in the army was only a lieutenant. Any of the generals present had a higher position than him. Naturally, there wasn't much room for him to speak. He just followed Marquis Nan and exchanged a few words with everyone. Fortunately, although Muyang grew up smoothly, he didn't develop the bad habit of being arrogant. The scene could be considered harmonious and cheerful. After the greetings, Marquis Nan asked seriously, "General Liu, is the army ready to depart?" Lu Jingxian didn't hesitate and said clearly, "The army is ready to depart. As long as Wang Fei and Marquis Yi give the order, we can depart at any time." Feng Zhiyao smiled, "General Liu, we are really tired from the journey. Let's depart tomorrow morning." Lu Jingxian looked at everyone and said with a smile, "General Feng is right. This old man didn't think it through. Wang Fei, Marquis Yi, please return to the camp to rest for the night. It will also allow the soldiers to conserve their energy." In the vast camp, it was already quiet at night. They were going to depart early tomorrow morning, so most of the soldiers went to bed early. Of course, this didn't include the generals who were sitting in the tent discussing matters. In the tent, Yili changed into a light blue robe and sat in the main seat in the center. Below her sat Feng Zhiyao, Lu Jingxian, Sun Yan, and the other generals according to their ranks. As for the deputy commanders, Nan Ho and Muyang, they had already been invited to rest after the discussion. This was the first time that all the generals had seen Yili, the mistress of the Ding King's residence. Rather than saying that they respected Yili's identity as Princess Ding, they respected the jade pendant on her waist. A general stood up and said, "Wang Fei, when will the prince be able to return?" Wang Fei only had the status of supervising the troops. As the deputy commander, Marquis Nan was the person with the highest authority in the Mahist army. Although Marquis Nan had always been neutral, it still made these generals who were loyal to the Prince Ding mansion feel uneasy. Yili shook her head lightly and said, "The prince is far away in the northern tribes. He will need some time to rush back after receiving the news." But now, the war at the border could not wait for Prince's return. Or, if the prince is not here, the generals will not fight. All the generals were stunned. Yili continued, "I understand everyone's loyalty to the Prince Ding mansion and the prince. However, this consort also hopes that all of you can understand one thing. What exactly does the Mo family army exist for?" Her clear and beautiful eyes lightly swept over everyone. "It is for the peace of the people of Great Chu. Every Mahist army soldier also has parents and children. Protecting the Dechu state is protecting the Mahist army's own family." Everyone was silent. Lu Jingxian said with some hesitation, "Do we really have to listen to Marquis Nan's command?" Yili said, "If Marquis Nan and the Mahist army have the same goal, why can't we temporarily listen to his command? The prince cannot rush back now. This is reality. Can we tell the West Hill people that Prince Ding is not here and that we will fight again in a few days?" Hearing this, everyone's expressions couldn't help but twist. Feng Zhiyao smiled and said, "Wang Fei, I think everyone is worried that if the Mahist army listens to Marquis Nan's command, will it be disadvantageous to us if he obtains the military power of the Mahist army?" Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled, "Marquis Nan will not obtain the military power of the Mahist army. I will follow Marquis Nan at any time. Even so, there are some disadvantages. But right now, this is the only way. Speaking of which, Marquis Nan is temporarily acting as the commander-in-chief. He cannot personally attend every battle. So, I will have to trouble the generals on the battlefield. Everyone said in unison, we will not disappoint Wang Fei. Yili nodded and said, I will have to trouble the generals. How much do you know about the situation at the front? As soon as she said this, the tent immediately fell silent. Although they had a grudge against the people sent by the emperor, it was also because the emperor had spared no effort to suppress the Mahist army these past few years. Originally, the Mahist army was scattered to guard the various borders of the Dechu state. However, because Mo Jingqi was worried, he took advantage of the time when Prince Ding was recuperating in the mansion and the Mahist army was greatly weakened to transfer all the Mahist army inland. Almost all the soldiers stationed at the borders were the emperor's trusted aides or generals who didn't get along well with the Prince Ding mansion. And now, West Hill had invaded the Dechu state. They were also invading the land that they had protected for generations. How could they not be anxious? Lu Jingxian said in a low voice. This time, West Hill came prepared. Genom of Gojoseon personally led 300,000 soldiers to invade the border. According to the news from the front, there are several 100,000 soldiers surrounding Xinyang. The soldiers sent by the imperial court have found Genom of Gojoseon and lost more than half of their ambush. In the past few days, we've discussed this. I'm afraid that Xinyang city will not be able to be defended. Everyone's expressions were ugly. Xinyang was the granary of the northwest. Once Xinyang was lost, not only would they lose a city and a pond, but the food of the people and even the army would also be threatened. Yili thought for a moment, then asked, based on the speed of our march, what is the worst that can happen? Lu Jingxian said, the Xiling army will cross Xinyang and occupy the entire Qinzhou. Then they will enter the palace and enter Hanzhou's Jiangxia town. Yili raised her brows. Lu Jingxian explained, there are 50,000 of our soldiers stationed near Jiangxia. The main commander, General Yuan Pei, is also a veteran of the battlefield. Right now, he should have gone to reinforce Xinyang. Once Xinyang is lost, he should lead the troops to retreat to Jiangxia. If we continue on our way, we should be able to reinforce Jiangxia in time. Yili nodded. She had analyzed this with Feng Zhiyao before, and the conclusion was similar to Lu Jingxian's. Yili rubbed her forehead and asked, you only talked about the situation of the middle army of West Hill. What about the south and north? Lu Jingxian said, the south and north have at least 150,000 soldiers each. They are attacking Jai Pass in the south and Tianyun Pass in the north. Although the border guards are doing their best to resist, I'm afraid that the situation is not optimistic. Who is leading the south and north? Lu Jingxian shook his head. Sun Yan said, Princess, it is said that the south is led by Lei Tingfeng, Crown Prince of Genom of Gojoseon. This person has been taught by Genom of Gojoseon since he was young. When he was 19 years old, he fought against the northern tribes on the battlefield. He is not to be underestimated. The commander of the north is a veteran of West Hill, Shang Wanyi. This person does not have any great achievements, and he is over 60 years old. But, he is the teacher of Genom of Gojoseon in West Hill. Yili nodded. After thinking for a long time, she raised her head and said, Thank you for your hard work today. We will depart early tomorrow morning. Everyone should go back and rest. Everyone stood up and bid farewell to Yili, then turned and left. Only Feng Zhiyao, Xue Jing and Su Qingze were left in the tent. Feng Zhiyao smiled as he looked at Yili's deeply furrowed brows and said, West Hill is coming aggressively. Does Princess have a headache? Yili smiled bitterly and said, How can I not have a headache? She was not a peerless genius. Frankly speaking, she did not have the energy for such a large-scale war. If it was a small group of special operations, she was confident that she could look down on the world. But when it came to mobilizing troops and giving advice, even though she had received a lot of advice from Mo Xiuyao, she still could not help but feel a little weak at the beginning. Chapter 312. Feng Zhiyao said, "I'm sure that Westhill sent at least 600,000 soldiers this time. With so many soldiers and the reputation of Westhill Genom of Gojoseon as the god of war, not to mention you, princess consort, even those veterans on the battlefield are worried." Although Westhill Genom of Gojoseon had been defeated by Mo Lufang, the prince regent of Dechu state, Mo Lufang was dead and he was still alive. "Li, you did well." Su Qingze looked at Yi Li and said lightly. His usually cold eyes were filled with a touch of warmth. Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "Second brother, don't praise me. I may look calm on the surface, but my heart is in a mess." Su Qingze said, "Don't be too nervous. Just do what you can. If there's anything you want me to do, just ask." Yi Li nodded, "Thank you, second brother." At this time, Mo Xiuyao, who was far away in the northern tribes, felt cold in his heart. Looking up at the bright moon in the sky, he couldn't help but think of the past year. Since the accident, he had never thought that his life would be so comfortable and happy. At first, they were like family and friends, then they helped each other hand in hand, and then they were deeply attached to each other. He didn't know when, but Li's every frown and smile had been engraved in his heart, and it would be difficult to remove in this life. "Prince." A shadow guard quietly appeared behind him. "What's the news?" The shadow guard said, "The list of the people behind the assassination of Princess Consort has been investigated. And since Westhill's invasion, the Emperor has summoned Princess Consort to the palace several times. It seems that he wants to take the military power of the Mahist army from Princess Consort. But he hasn't succeeded." Mo Xiuyao's eyes were dark. He sneered and said, "He can never tell what's important and what's urgent. Go and tell Ronghua that no matter what, we must leave tomorrow." The shadow guard hesitated for a moment and said, "I'm afraid that Princess Ronghua does not have such a deep influence on Yilu Hong." Mo Xiuyao said nonchalantly, "If Yilu Hong wants to defeat Yilu Yi, he naturally knows what to do. Go and prepare. We'll set off tomorrow." The shadow guard nodded, this subordinate obeys. Dismissing the guards, Mo Xiuyao raised his head to look at the bright moon in the sky, his gaze gradually becoming gentle. Li. Xiuyao always makes you suffer. One day, I will deliver the best in the world to you. As for those who want to hurt you, I will never let them off." Originally, Mo Xiuyao should have returned to the capital the moment he heard the news of Westhill's invasion. However, the king of the northern tribe's attitude was unusually firm. He insisted that Mo Xiuyao stay and attend the crown prince's wedding. He even faintly threatened him. Mo Xiuyao was not afraid of his threats. However, if he really left on the spot, the Dechu state would very likely have to face the attack of two countries at the same time. The king of the northern tribes was not ready to annex the Dechu state yet. However, he did not mind at all delaying Mo Xiuyao, the young god of war, for a period of time for Westhill. Perhaps he could even gain some benefits from it. Therefore, he also deserved to die. 10 li outside of Xinyang City, Westhill's hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses were eyeing the city not far away. That city was more attractive and meaningful than a mere border city. There were countless provisions and military supplies. It was the richest and most prosperous city in the northwest. That city would become their first real step in conquering the Dechu state. In the commander-in-chief's tent, Genom of Gojoseon, who was almost 50 years old, was sitting behind a desk. He held the memorial that his subordinate had just sent to him with one hand and looked at it for a while. Suddenly, he laughed wildly. The generals below looked at each other in dismay. They did not know what had made the prince so happy. When he had finished laughing, he said loudly, "Mo Lu Fong. You also have a day like this. If you were to see your Ding royal estate in this state, would you regret it?" The generals all exchanged glances. The person standing at the front stepped forward and asked, "Prince, is there any good news?" Genom of Gojosian casually handed over the memorial and said to everyone with a smile, "The Ding royal estate really does not have a successor. A woman is actually in charge of military power." The general who saw the memorial had a strange expression on his face. He said, "Deputy Marquis Nan Ho, the Ding royal consort is supervising the army. What does Dong Chu mean by this?" Genom of Gojosian lightly snorted and said, "We have no choice. I have also heard of Marquis Nan Ho. He has always been neutral and does not concern himself with worldly affairs. It's fine if he is a talented general. However, he does not have the ability to lead the Mahist army. Moreover, the military power of the Mahist army is not that easy to obtain. Could it be that the Mahist army is currently in the hands of the Ding royal consort?" The general said in shock. Genom of Gojosian nodded and smiled thoughtfully, "That's right. Mo Xiuyao is far away in the northern tribes and cannot rush back. Without Mo Xiuyao, the Ding royal estate does not have anyone who can lead the army. Now, the military power has fallen into the hands of a 16 or 17-year-old girl." The generals below the tent could not help but become excited. They all whispered to each other for a while. Someone stepped forward and said, "Since it is like this, Prince, we can take this opportunity to take care of the Mahist army. This will prevent them from reuniting with Prince Ding and causing trouble for our expedition to Eastern Chu." Genom of Gojosian slightly narrowed his eyes. His right hand carelessly stroked his empty left sleeve as he said, "Although I want to fight with Mo Xiuyao, but, as a general, we must not fight based on personal feelings. This time, it is indeed the best opportunity that the heavens have given us. If we can destroy this army, the Ding royal estate will not be able to achieve anything. We will listen to Prince's orders." Everyone said in unison. The idea of destroying the Ding royal estate made everyone's hearts become faintly excited. Genom of Gojosian nodded in satisfaction, "Very good. Speed up the attack on Xinyang. We must take Xinyang city within 3 days. Then head to Jiangxia and wipe out the Mahist army in one fell swoop. As you command." Reporting to Wang Fei, a letter has arrived on the second day. In the Mahist army's barracks, Yili was sitting in a large tent. She was discussing matters with Marquis Nan and the others while the entire army was stationed. Shuo Jing came in holding a letter. Yili did not even raise her head as she lightly said, "Translate it for me." Shuo Jing nodded and walked to the desk in the corner of the tent to translate the letter. Yili continued to speak to Marquis Nan, "It will take at least 7 days for us to reach Jiangxia. I'm afraid that it will be difficult to speed up the army," as Marquis Nan said. Marquis Nan frowned and said, "Why is that? The Mahist army has always moved quickly. I remember that at their fastest, they could travel hundreds of li in a day." Yili shook her head and said, "Marquis Nan, that was a small army. We have an army of nearly 300,000. The journey that should have taken 10 days has been shortened to 5 days. Do you think that even if we really reach the border, these 300,000 soldiers will still have the strength to fight? I'm afraid that the West Hill people will not give us time to rest. Once we reach Jiangxia, what awaits us will only be a fierce battle." Marquis Nan sighed heavily, "How could I not know what Wang Fei is talking about? It's just that I am really worried about Xinyang." Yili shook her head and said in a low voice, "Xinyang cannot be protected. With Marquis Nan's ability, how many days can you defend Xinyang against the Genom kingdom of Gojosian?" Marquis Nan thought for a moment and said, Xinyang City does not lack military supplies. If it were me, I could defend it for a month. Yili said, General Lang can defend it for half a month. Marquis Nan, do you know how many days it has been today? Even if we grew wings, we would not be able to reach Xinyang in time. Furthermore, Xinyang City does not lack anything. Xinyang City lacks water. Chapter 313. Everyone's expression changed slightly. If they were short on food, they could barely survive for a few days. But if they were short on water, there was nothing much to say. Xinyang was located in the northwest and had a shortage of water. After being besieged by Xiling, it was almost certain that they would be short of water. No matter how fast we go, Genom of Gojoseon will definitely be waiting for us in Jiangxia. Yili sighed. Mu Yang frowned and asked, what if Jiangxia is also breached? Lu Jingxian raised his eyebrows and said, don't worry, Prince Mu. Although Jiangxia's defending general, General Yuan Pei, only has tens of thousands of troops, Jiangxia is completely different from Xinyang. It won't be a problem to defend for 10 days to half a month. Even if Genom of Gojoseon really has a large army, as long as Jiangxia has a single soldier, they won't let the Xiling people take half a step in. Hearing this, Marquis Nan and Mu Yang couldn't help but blush. The Mahist army had guarded the border for hundreds of years and had never let the enemy take a step into the Chu state. But now, because the emperor was afraid that the Prince Ding mansion had left the Mahist army idle, the Xiling army had already taken several cities and advanced 300 to 400 li in less than a month after the war started. Marquis Nan nodded and said, it's good that Princess knows. Yili smiled faintly and said, I know that Marquis Nan is also worried about the war. Rest assured, Marquis Nan, General Sun Yan has already sent the Black Cloud Cavalry to Jiangxia. Princess. Shuo Jing had already finished translating the letter and came over to deliver it to Yili. Yili lowered her head and read for a while. She frowned and handed the letter to Marquis Nan. Marquis Nan, what do the generals think? Marquis Nan glanced at it and was surprised to see Shuo Jing standing beside Yili with a calm expression. He frowned and said, Genom of Gojoseon suddenly increased the speed of their attack. Could it be that they want to take Jiangxia before we arrive? No. Princess Consort, I'm afraid something bad has happened. When Lu Jingxian and Feng Zhiyao saw Marquis Nan's expression change, they hurriedly took the letter and read it together. The more they read, the deeper their frowns became. Genom of Gojoseon sent people to attack Xinyang, but at the same time, he split up his troops to take a roundabout route. Even the South Army, which was not far from them, had sent a team to the north. Princess. Feng Zhiyao frowned. Marquis Nan said in a low voice, Genom of Gojoseon is attacking Xinyang fiercely while diverting troops to take a detour. I'm afraid he wants to cut off General Yuan's escape route. Yili frowned deeply. After a while, she said, bring me the map. At this time, the problem of not having a smooth flow of information was manifested. No matter what they analyzed now, they could not immediately pass it on to the generals at the front. They could only hope that the generals at the front also saw the other party's intentions and made the necessary response. Fortunately, this kind of problem was often mutual. Shuo Jing turned around and took out a folded piece of paper from behind him. He slowly unfolded it. On the paper, there were winding lines marked with mountains and rivers. The border of the Chu state, from south to north, was clear at a glance. Yili picked up the pen on the table and marked out the routes of the Xiling troops mentioned in the letter. She frowned and raised her head to ask, has the detailed map of the northwest been sent back? Shuo Jing turned around and took out another one from his luggage. It arrived this morning. I was just about to show it to Princess Consort. Yili cleared the table and spread out the map. She said, "What's the use of showing it to me? I've never been to the Northwest." "Marquis, General Liu, come and take a look." Everyone had been curious about the map in front of them for a long time. Hearing Yi Li's words, they immediately gathered around. There were two maps of about the same size on the table. One was clearly a map of all the border areas to the west of Dechu State. The other was much more detailed, but only the Northwest. They had never seen it in detail before. Liu Jingxian praised, "Good stuff. This general has been at the Northwest border since I was 20 years old. Even after 20 years, I don't dare say I know more than this map." Marquis Nan nodded and pointed at a place on the map. "General Liu is right. This marquis has been to the Northwest a few times in the past. Princess Consort's map is very detailed." Yi Li smiled in satisfaction. How could it not be detailed? This group of people who had just been trained had all been sent out. Adding on the original maps, if they were still not familiar with the Northwest, then they had learned for nothing. Yi Li stared at the two maps for a long time. She picked up the pen and drew a line on the map. She said in a deep voice, "Immediately send orders to the troops in the south. All troops near Shiling's Southern Army to gather in the west. Intercept the troops from the Southern Army." Shuo Jing nodded in acknowledgement. Yi Li raised an eyebrow in thought and then smiled faintly. She lowered her head and took out a piece of paper. She wrote a line of characters on the paper and handed it to Shuo Jing. She asked, "Where is Qin Feng?" Shuo Jing lowered his head and thought for a while. He said, "Near the Ling Pass. He should be preparing to come up north to meet with us." Yi Li lowered her head to look at the location of the Ling Pass. She said, "Tell him not to come back. Give this to him." The next step of the plan. Shuo Jing put away the paper and walked out without looking at it. "Does Princess Consort have a plan?" Mu Yang asked with raised eyebrows. Yi Li smiled faintly. "It can't be considered a plan. I'm just making some arrangements in advance. Just in case." Knowing that she had no intention of explaining, Mu Yang only looked at her with a complicated gaze and did not pursue the matter. The Mahist army had listened to the orders of the Ding King for 100 years. In recent years, they did not have a good impression of the emperor. As someone who was sent here by the emperor, his status was naturally awkward. Fortunately, Mu Yang was also a very tactful person. Marquis Nan looked at Yi Li and then at Mu Yang as if he did not notice the undercurrent between the two of them. He stroked his beard and said with a smile, "It's good that Princess Consort has a plan. We're hundreds of miles away now, so there's nothing we can do. It's better to rush to the battlefield to provide support as soon as possible." Yi Li and Mu Yang both nodded in agreement. Only then did Marquis Nan smile and discuss with Yi Li and the others for a while before getting up to leave and return to his tent to rest. After Marquis Nan left, Mu Yang had no choice but to get up and leave even if he wanted to stay and continue listening to everyone's reply. Xinyang City. On the city wall, Ling Qingyu looked at the billowing flags in the distance with a dark expression. Xinyang had been surrounded by the army for more than 10 days. If they still could not get out of the siege, even if the Xiling army did not break through, it would soon collapse from the inside. In addition, more than half of the reinforcements who had just arrived at the border had been injured. As the deputy general, Marquis Nan's heir had gone missing on the battlefield, which made the morale of the soldiers guarding the city even lower. If the general of Xinyang City had not died in battle and there was no one to preside over the overall situation, it was unknown whether he would still be standing on the city wall. "General Leng, when will the reinforcements from the imperial court arrive?" A tired-looking general hurried over and asked Ling Qingyu rudely. These soldiers were originally very dissatisfied with this general who had become the commander-in-chief of an army at such a young age. Moreover, He had been beaten into a sorry state by Shiling's Genom of Gojosian before arriving, which made them look down on him even more. Moreover, he was the son of the Defender General of the state and was personally conferred the title of Great General by the Emperor. After the general of Xinyang City died in battle, he was the highest commander in Xinyang City. Although everyone was respectful on the surface, no one knew what they were thinking. As for the high-ranking generals of Xinyang City, they did not even bother to put on an act. A trace of embarrassment and anger flashed across Ling Qingyu's cold face. His life had been smooth since he was young and he became the commander of the Imperial Guards with his own ability. He was one of the top young talents in the Chu capital. However, he kept running into a wall. His originally confident heart couldn't help but become hesitant and doubtful. Chapter 3:14. Frowning, Ling Qingyu said, "They will naturally arrive when it's time. Just wait patiently, General." The man's face darkened. This general can wait, but Suncreed City can't. General Lang, look at the city below and inside. How many more days do you think Suncreed City can hold on? Shut up. Ling Qingyu roared, his gaze shooting at the person in front of him like an arrow. He said coldly, Suncreed City won't fall. That person was startled by the murderous look in his eyes. He turned around and snorted, since General Lang has such confidence, this general will wait and see. After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and turned around to leave quickly. Seeing the other party leave without hesitation, Ling Qingyu's gaze became even more malicious. But when he turned back to look at the endless enemy army in the distance, he could only forcibly suppress them. Suddenly, the sound of drums below the city shook the heavens. Ling Qingyu looked into the distance in shock. The originally motionless banners began to move. Taking a deep breath, Ling Qingyu raised his voice and said, "Defend the city." Once again, the two armies engaged in a fierce battle above and below the city walls. On the other hand, the defenders were clearly showing signs of exhaustion and weakness, which made the soldiers below the city even more excited as they charged forward. In a certain tall building in Suncreed City, deafening battle cries could be heard from the city gates outside the slanted window. Inside the window, an ordinary-looking man said in a low voice, Suncreed City can't be defended anymore. Get ready. We're withdrawing. Another man frowned. Should we ask General Yuan to support them from the outside? The princess consort and the reinforcements are already halfway there. The man shook his head. It's useless. Haven't you noticed that the Xiling army's attacks have been much fiercer these past 2 days? Genom of Gojosian is probably going to take Suncreed City at all costs. Ling Qingyu can't suppress the soldiers of Suncreed City. Even if General Yuan has been harassing them from the outside, he won't be able to delay them for long. It's very likely that General Yuan and the others will be trapped as well. All right. Immediately send a message to ask General Yuan to leave the battlefield and return to Jiangxia. You guys go first. I'll stay behind to handle matters in Suncreed City. All right. Be careful. After sending off his companion, the man turned and went downstairs to the official's residence of Suncreed City. In the West Hill military camp, Genom of Gojosian sat in a comfortable chair with a calm expression on his face. He supported his chin with one hand and closed his eyes to rest while waiting for news from outside. There would definitely be news of Suncreed City's fall by today. Although that kid in Suncreed City had some ability, he was still too inexperienced. Under such circumstances, he would be powerless to turn the tide. As soon as he thought of the countless grains, cloth, gold, and silver in Suncreed City becoming the resources he would use to attack the Dechu state in the future, his mood couldn't be described with words. How are the preparations on Yuan Pei's side? Remembering something, Genom of Gojosian opened his eyes and asked. The high-ranking officer, who was also sitting down and waiting for the news, immediately stood up and said, following Prince's instructions, our army has already secretly planned a way to return to Jiangxia. Although we can't find Yuan Pei's men for the time being, once Xinyang falls, he will inevitably return to Jiangxia. At that time, we won't have to worry about not being able to catch him. Genom of Gojoseon nodded in satisfaction. Very good. Outside the tent, the sound of a retreat was heard. Genom of Gojoseon's smile deepened. He stood up and said with a smile, Xinyang has fallen. All the high-ranking officers' faces were filled with joy. Congratulations, Prince. Genom of Gojoseon shook his head. No, congratulations to all of us. With Xinyang, we will be invincible in our attack on the Dechu state. This time, the heavens are indeed protecting Xiling. All the high-ranking officers chanted in unison, the heavens are protecting Xiling. Outside the tent, the hurried footsteps of a messenger soldier could be heard. Reporting to Prince, Suncreed's city has fallen. Very good. What about the kid guarding the city? Genom of Gojoseon asked. The messenger soldier hesitated for a moment before saying, we haven't found Xinyang's commanding general, Leng Qingyu. Hearing this, Genom of Gojoseon couldn't help but frown. He waved his hand and said, go investigate again. Immediately send back any news. Yes. 2 hours later, the soldiers who had gone to attack the city had all returned to camp. The tent was filled with jubilation. Only Genom of Gojoseon frowned. Seeing this, his subordinates couldn't help but ask, Prince, is there something wrong? Genom of Gojoseon shook his head. I don't know. I keep feeling that something isn't right. Reporting to Prince, something bad has happened. Outside the tent, someone loudly requested an audience. Genom of Gojoseon's heart sank. He said coldly, come in. What happened to Suncreed City? The person said, reporting to Prince, there should have been less than 20% of the provisions in Suncreed City. What? Everyone was shocked. Could it be that the East Chu people knew that they would lose and moved the provisions in advance? Impossible. After Suncreed was surrounded, even a mosquito couldn't fly out, let alone so much provisions. Genom of Gojoseon's face was gloomy. He asked in a low voice, is there anything else? The soldier looked at Genom of Gojoseon's expression and said in a trembling voice, there's also the silver in Suncreed City's treasury. The silver and banknotes from several banks have all disappeared. Suncreed City has less than 30% of the original amount of silver. The tent was silent. All the generals peeked at Genom of Gojoseon's expression. No one dared to speak. Suncreed City wasn't the richest city in Eastern Chu, but it was the place where the Chu state stored the most military supplies. It was also one of the top 5 commercial cities in the Chu state, even though their trading partner was Xiling. Originally, everyone was drooling over this city because of the countless provisions, gold, and silver. But now, there was nothing left. Good. After a long time, Genom of Gojoseon suddenly laughed coldly. What a good Ding palace. Everyone was stunned. Someone asked suspiciously, Prince, you're saying it was done by the Ding palace? Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, other than the Ding palace, who else could hide all the provisions so quickly without anyone noticing? But, isn't Prince Ding in the northern tribes? That means there's another expert in the Ding palace. Reporting to Prince, General Zheng just gave the order to massacre the city. A soldier hurried to the door and reported. Bastard! Genom of Gojoseon slammed the table and stood up. He said in a stern voice, who gave the order? The soldier trembled in fear and quickly said, General Zheng. General Zheng brought people to a pawn shop to get something and had a conflict with the citizens. Then General Zheng gave the order to massacre the city. immediately passed down Ai's order to stop the massacre. If anyone dares to violate it, execute them on the spot. Order Jing Bian to come see I immediately. Yes. In the large tent, the soldiers looked at each other in dismay. Prince, it's fine to kill those Eastern Chu people. Leaving so many people is a waste of food. That's right, Prince. Sun Creed City has fallen and we haven't gained anything. We might as well kill those Eastern Chu people and show them what we're made of. Stupid. Genom of Gojoseon coldly said, how many people does Eastern Chu have? Can you kill them all? Right now, only the Eastern Chu army will resist us. Once the Eastern Chu citizens know about the massacre, all of them will resist us. Chapter 3:15. Many people did not care, Eastern Chu's army can't do anything to us. What can a few commoners do? Genom of Gojoseon said in a deep voice, in short, without Ai's orders, you are not allowed to kill Eastern Chu's commoners. Reporting to Prince, Yuan Pei led tens of thousands of Mahist army to break out of the encirclement and head towards Jiangxia. Hearing this, Genom of Gojoseon frowned. What happened? The troops that the heir sent to stop Yuan Pei were ambushed and completely wiped out. Moreover, Yuan Pei seems to be very clear about our army's layout and terrain. He led his troops to split up and pass through our army's gaps. Although he lost some troops, the Mahist army's main force did not suffer too much damage. Reporting to Prince, we just received news from the Southern Army. 3 days ago, the heir was ambushed and the heir was seriously injured. Genom of Gojoseon suddenly stood up. How is Tingfeng? The heir is no longer in danger, but his injuries are quite serious. I'm afraid he won't be able to lead troops in a short period of time. Genom of Gojoseon lowered his head and pondered for a long time. He slowly suppressed the anger in his heart and waved his hand. I understand. You may leave first. The originally joyous atmosphere in the large tent became gloomy because of the successive news. After a long time, Genom of Gojoseon laughed softly. Good, the Ding Palace is indeed filled with experts. In this battle, I did not win. Prince. Forget it. Send someone to tell Tingfeng that I will send someone else to take over the Southern Army. Tell him to come to Xinyang as soon as possible. Genom of Gojoseon waved his hand and calmly said, no matter what, Xinyang is already ours. Let him take charge of the situation. I don't believe that those provisions and gold and silver can fly away. They must still be in the city. Yes. On the road after the heavy rain, Yili rode at the front of the army, but her beautiful brows were tightly knitted and she did not speak. Nan Ho and the others were by her side. Seeing her so curious, they asked, What's wrong, princess? Yili shook her head and said, Nothing, I'm just worried about the situation in Xinyang. Nan Ho raised his eyebrows in confusion. Xinyang's fall was already a foregone conclusion, what was there to worry about? Yili frowned and looked at the roadside. Because they were not on the official road, there was a steady stream of people fleeing from the northwest. Yili had mixed feelings as she looked at the sorry state of the commoners with their families. In truth, the reason why the war was so one-sided was mostly because of the infighting in the imperial court. If they had been prepared and sent reinforcements in time, this would not have happened. In any era, the ones who would suffer the most from the flames of war would always be the common people. Yili vaguely remembered a sentence that her teacher had taught her in her previous life. Prosperity, the common people suffer. Death, the people suffer. Wang Fei. Shuajing urged his horse to catch up from behind. He rode half a horse's length behind Yili and spoke in a low voice. Yili pulled on the rein slightly and slowed down. She tilted her head to look at Shuajing. Shuajing said in a low voice, I just received news that Xinyang has fallen. Yili nodded, her expression as usual. The fall of Xinyang was within everyone's expectations. After a moment of silence, she asked, "How is General Yuan?" "General Yuan has already brought his men back to Jiangxia." "But..." Shuo Jing hesitated for a moment. "I just received news. The Xiling army has slaughtered Xinyang City." "What?" Yi Li's expression darkened. Her originally gentle features were instantly dyed with a layer of murderous frost. Nan Ho, who was closest to them, clearly heard Shuo Jing's words. The reins in his hand shook and he quickly steadied himself. He only stared fixedly at Shuo Jing without speaking. Shuo Jing said in a low voice, "After the Xiling army entered the city, they clashed with the common people. Afterwards, the general who led the attack, Xing Bian, gave the order to slaughter Xinyang." What did Xiling's Genom of Gojosian mean? Genom of Gojosian did not go to the front lines. By the time he gave the order to stop it, it was already too late. At least 2/3 of the common people in Xinyang died an unnatural death. Shuo Jing's voice was slightly hoarse. Since the founding of Dechu State, this was the first time that a city had been slaughtered. Many of the soldiers could not accept this. Yi Li laughed coldly. She pulled on the reins and galloped forward. Nan Ho paused and looked at Shuo Jing with some confusion. Shuo Jing hesitated for a moment before following. Yi Li did not go far. She stopped at the side of the road and silently watched the fleeing common people pass by. Shuo Jing said in a low voice, "Wang Fei." Yi Li turned to look at him. She played with the horsewhip in one hand as she said, "Someone once told me that letting the common people personally experience war is a disgrace to the soldiers and the country." Shuo Jing advised, "This is not Wang Fei's fault." Yi Li shook her head and laughed coldly, "Xing Bian, is it? His head will be at the king's manor. I want his head as a sacrifice to the souls of the people of Xinyang City. This subordinate understands. I guarantee that within 10 days, Xing Bian's head will be hung on the walls of Xinyang City." 7 days later, when Genom of Gojosian's army had reached Jiangxia, Lei Tingfeng, who had stayed behind in Xinyang, sent someone to deliver a secret letter. Xing Bian, who had also stayed in Xinyang City, had been killed in his own room. His head was hung on the walls of Xinyang City. Next to the head was a flying dragon and phoenix character. It clearly stated that the murderer was from the king's manor. After receiving Lei Tingfeng's secret letter, Genom of Gojosian's face was as calm as water. After thinking for a while, he replied to Lei Tingfeng and ordered the attack on Jiangxia to be stepped up. Jiangxia was a small city less than 200 li away from Xinyang. The city was less than 1/3 the size of Xinyang City and was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. However, Xiling's military strength was equivalent to the sum of all the cities they had conquered in the past. The Xiling army, which had been unstoppable and seemingly invincible, finally witnessed the true strength of the Dechu State's army in front of this small city. Genom of Gojosian, who had not personally participated in the attack on a large city like Xinyang, personally stood behind the army this time. He stood on the hill and watched with his own eyes as the soldiers of the two armies fought endlessly below the city. He watched as the black-clothed soldiers on the city walls continuously beat down the enemies who tried to climb up the city walls as if they never knew fatigue. "Prince, I didn't expect a small city of 50,000 people to be so difficult to deal with. Shouldn't we think of something?" The general standing behind him asked in a low voice. He looked at the black-clothed figures on the city walls with eyes full of frustration and shadow. This was a mark that the Mahist army had used countless blood and lives to deeply engrave in the hearts of their enemies over the past 100 years. Genom of Gojosian sighed softly and said, "Fortunately, the emperor of the Dechu state does not trust the king's manor very much." The generals behind him did not ask why, because they were also rejoicing. If the ruler and his subjects of the Dechu state knew each other and trusted each other, why would they worry about the world being unjust? Day and night, step up the attack. We must take Jiangxia before the reinforcements from the Prince Ding mansion arrive. Genom of Gojosian said sternly. This general obeys. On the city walls in the distance, the gray-haired old General Yuan Pei stared at the enemy troops below the city walls, who seemed to never retreat. His brows were deeply furrowed. His eyes, which had seen through the world, were bloodshot and tired, but his back was straight. His eyes, which stared at the city walls, were filled with the determination to live and die with Jiangxia. Chapter 316. General Yuan. Ling Qingyu hurried over. It had been less than a month since the expedition, but Ling Qingyu's arrogant and indifferent young face was full of vicissitudes and frustration. Yuan Pei looked at him and shook his head. He sighed softly. General Ling, what's the matter? Ling Qingyu glanced at the place where the banners were fluttering in the distance and frowned. General Yuan, I'm afraid it'll be too much of a blow to the morale of the soldiers if we don't come out. Yuan Pei said, General Ling, don't worry. The morale of the Maoist army will not be suppressed just because of these few days. Everyone knows that our army doesn't have the strength to fight against Xiling at all. The only thing we can do now is to defend and wait for reinforcements. Ling Qingyu glanced at the soldiers on the city wall, and his eyes darkened. Yuan Pei was right. What was really hit was not the morale of the Maoist army, but the morale of the less than 10,000 soldiers he had brought out of Xinyang City. After this great defeat, these remnants of the defeated army had long since collapsed. In the past few days, the West Hills soldiers had been attacking non-stop, making them even more frightened. If this continued, there would be trouble before Jiangxia was broken. This is a battlefield. My mission is to protect Jiangxia. General Lang, a momentary dispute won't bring any benefits to the current situation. The Xiling soldiers are not useless. Once tens of thousands of us enter an army of hundreds of thousands, it'll be no different from water entering the sea. We can only be swallowed by them, Yuan Pei said earnestly. Ling Qingyu was silent. It was not that he didn't understand what Yuan Pei said, but he really couldn't bear the current predicament. It was the first time in his life that he had led an army and ended up like this. In fact, the outcome of this war had little to do with him. It could be foreseen that even if what awaited him in the near future was not the emperor's punishment, it would be a lifetime of idleness. He would never have the chance to lead an army again. Besieging the city, defending the city. The soldiers on both sides fought tirelessly day and night. Corpses piled up under the city wall and blood flowed like a river. The corpses of their own people and the corpses of their enemies could no longer be distinguished. Everyone seemed to be fighting by instinct. However, Jiangxia's military strength was only 50,000, and this included the number of people who had died in the battle to support Xinyang. In reality, there were less than 40,000 people. Even if the remnants of the defeated soldiers who had retreated from Xinyang were included, there were less than 50,000 people. Their enemy, on the other hand, had over 200,000 elite soldiers. These soldiers were trained by Genom of Gojosian over the past 10 years, and they were the best of the best. The number of soldiers guarding the city of Jiangxia was decreasing. Every time, it seemed like the city gate would be breached in the next moment. However, as time passed, the flags hanging on the city gate tower still belonged to the Dechu state and the Maoist army. Behind the Xiling army, Genom of Gojosian stared solemnly at the tightly shut city gate in the distance. Prince, they can't hold on any longer. Genom of Gojosian did not say anything, but his eyes were filled with respect for his enemy. It had been 5 days and 24 hours of continuous fierce attacks. There were only tens of thousands of people. Even he himself might not be able to guarantee that he could hold on until now. This was not something that could be done with wisdom and ability. The entire army must also have unparalleled faith and determination. After a long while, Genom of Gojosian said in a deep voice, "Continue. Take down Jiangxia in 2 hours." More than 2 hours later, the city gate of Jiangxia finally fell heavily and slowly. On the city gate tower, Yuan Pei, who was covered in blood, casually threw away his battle robe and glanced at the soldiers on the city gate tower. He said sternly, "Kill." All the soldiers' eyes were red. It was a disgrace for the city guarded by the Mahist army to be trampled by the enemy. They must use the enemy's blood to wash away this shame. All the soldiers desperately pounced on the enemy closest to them. On the city gate tower, at the city gate, and on the streets, killing was everywhere. Ling Qingyuk stood at the corner of the street, watching the killing in front of him. His eyes were so red that it seemed like blood would drip out. Behind him was a group of defeated soldiers. They could no longer fight after escaping from Xinyang, and no one asked them to pick up their weapons again. Ling Qingyu looked back at them and said in a deep voice, "Do you see? They are the same as you, soldiers of Dechu State." The city was also breached. What did they do? What did we do? It's my incompetence that I couldn't defend Xinyang. You're on your own. With that, he pulled out his sword and rushed out. The remaining soldiers looked at each other. After a long time, one of them rushed out with a knife in his hand. Then another, and another. A group of soldiers completely different from the Black Mahist army rushed out from the corner of the street and pounced on the enemy troops pouring in from the city gate. The whiling soldiers were blocked from entering the city, which aroused the bestial nature in their hearts. They howled and pounced on every soldier of Dechu State. In an instant, blood spurted out and covered the streets. Rumble, an earth-shattering sound came from afar. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned. The surviving Mahist army soldiers were ecstatic and angry. Black Cloud Cavalry. The Black Cloud Cavalry is here. Reinforcements are here. On the wide street, a black mass of people rushed over with great momentum and ferocious killing intent. The leader, a man in red, galloped over on his horse. His clear voice was full of murderous intent. Block the city gate. Don't let any of the soldiers who entered the city out. Left and right wings, go up the city wall. Yes. The Black Army emerged from the end of the street like a tide and quickly pounced on the people fighting on the street and at the city gate. The city gate that had collapsed a quarter of an hour ago was quickly closed again. The whiling soldiers who rushed into Jiangxia City in order to snatch military merits were horrified to find that they had become turtles in a jar, trapped beasts in a cage. The soldiers in black methodically rushed to where they needed to go. Countless people in black suddenly appeared on the city wall that had been filled with the gray figures of the whiling soldiers. The killing resumed. In the distance, Genom of Gojosian saw the sudden appearance of the soldiers in black on the city wall. His expression changed. Then he saw a flamboyant figure in red appear on the city wall. His body was like an invincible dragon. "Prince, that is Feng Xiao. The people of the Chu capital call him Third Young Master Feng. He is the son of a concubine of the richest man in the Chu capital. He was expelled from his family when he was young. He followed Mo Xiaoyao on the battlefield in his teens. He is Mo Xiaoyao's most trusted aide. His appearance here must mean that the Mahist army's reinforcements have arrived." Genom of Gojosian's expression was gloomy. He said in a low voice, "Continue the attack." The war drums shook the sky. The gray figures and the black figures fought fiercely. But the gate of Jiangxia City was never pushed open again. When countless archers in black appeared on the city wall and arrows rained down on the people below the city wall, a snow-white slender figure calmly walked up the city wall. Standing beside her were South Marquis Muyang and Zhuo Jing. It was obviously a bloody storm, but the snow-white robe was unexpectedly not stained with any blood. The spotless white robe gave people a kind of inexplicable coldness and sternness. Yi stood on the city wall and looked at the commander flag of the Shieling army behind the enemy in the distance. Even if she could not see the other person's face, she could still feel the majestic momentum and exposed anger on the other side. Her lips slightly curved into a sneer. She ordered in a cold voice, "Don't leave any of the Wiling soldiers in Jiangxia City. Throw all the corpses out of the city." Chapter 317. Shui Jing nodded. This subordinate obeys. Yi looked back and revealed a provocative smile at a certain place in the distance. "Is that the Ding King's consort?" Genom of Gojoseon asked in a deep voice. The general beside him looked at the graceful woman in snow-white clothes on the city wall and hesitated before saying, "It seems that she is the Ding King's consort." In fact, not many people had seen the Ding King's consort. However, a woman who could appear with the Mahist army on the city wall of Jiangxia should be the Ding King's consort. Genom of Gojoseon looked for a long time before suddenly laughing out loud. "Good. Interesting, the Ding King's consort. It is said that the women of Eastern Chu are weak, but this Ding King's consort is even better than the noble ladies of West Hill. No wonder Princess Lingyun was scared out of her wits." The general beside him had a stiff smile on his face. He didn't know whether he should agree with Genom of Gojoseon's praise of the Ding King's consort. Now, the Ding King's consort had single-handedly ruined their plan to take Jiangxia. Moreover, the soldiers who had previously rushed into Jiangxia City were most likely already dead by now. As a result, the number of soldiers they had lost in this small city of Jiangxia had exceeded the total number of soldiers they had lost during this time. This was undoubtedly a heavy blow to the morale of the Shieling army. "Prince, the soldiers who rushed into the city," Genom of Gojoseon waved his hand and shook his head. "It's too late. Attack the city with all your strength. Capture the Ding King's consort alive and you will be rewarded with 1,000 marquises." "Yes." When it was close to evening, the West Hill finally retreated. Without knowing how many reinforcements the Mahist army had, it was unwise to continue such a fierce attack. If the strength of the two armies was similar, then it was likely that both sides would suffer in the end. After all, this was Eastern Chu's territory. Eastern Chu could continuously replenish soldiers and provisions at any time. After their harvest in Xinjiang was clearly lower than expected, they had to be careful everywhere. Otherwise, if they weren't careful, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Seeing the Shieling army quickly retreating after the horn sounded, the people on the city wall heaved a sigh of relief. The remaining soldiers of Jiangxia City couldn't help but cheer. Yuan Pei walked in front of Yi, wearing clothes that were half-dried and covered in wounds. "This general, Yuan Pei, the defending general of Jiangxia, greets Wang Fei." Yi hurriedly reached out to stop him from kneeling down. She said in a deep voice, "Old general, you've worked hard. It's this consort's fault for being late and causing trouble to the general." Yuan Pei's expression changed. His bloodshot eyes could not help but flicker with a suspicious light. He raised his voice and said, "This general does not dare. This general is incompetent and nearly caused Jiangxia to fall into the hands of the West Hill. I dare not complain." Yi smiled faintly and said, "The situation forced you to do so. It is not your fault. There's no need for us to delve deeper into these matters. General, take your men and rest for a while. Leave Jiangxia to us for the time being." Yuan Pei nodded heavily. Feng Zhiyao stood behind Yi and said with a smile, "General Yuan, please rest assured. Feng San will never let the West Hill people take a step past Jiangxia." Yuan Pei was not polite. He cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your hard work, General Feng. After rearranging the city defense, Yili led her men down the city tower. As soon as she walked down the city tower, she saw Ling Qingyu standing under the city wall with a blood-stained sword with a wooden expression. After thinking for a while, Yili stepped forward and asked, "General Ling, are you okay?" Ling Qingyu looked up at Yili and said with a wry smile, "What's wrong with a defeated general?" Yili raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Victory and defeat are common in war. This is not all General Ling's fault. General, take care." Ling Qingyu was stunned for a while before saying, "Thank you, Princess." After watching Yili leave, Ling Qingyu looked at the long sword in his hand and put it back into the sheath. Princess Ding might be right. This failure was not his fault alone, but he was the only one who could bear the responsibility for it now. Fortunately, Jiangxia was still there, and the Mahist army had arrived. "General Lang." Ling Qingyu turned to leave when Marquis Nan's voice came from behind. Marquis Nan stood on the side of the street. He was obviously older and more tired than the last time they met. This war had just begun, but many of them seemed to have aged 10 years. Marquis Nan looked at Ling Qingyu for a long time before asking in a deep voice, "General Ling, do you have any news about Quan Er?" Ling Qingyu said sadly, "That day, the enemy attacked. The heir led a group of people to divert the enemy's attention, and they were all wiped out. Marquis, I'm sorry. I understand." The faint light in Marquis Nan's eyes gradually faded as he sighed softly and said in a low voice. He didn't even say goodbye to Ling Qingyu and turned to leave. Ling Qingyu looked at Marquis Nan's lonely and bleak figure and felt a chill in his bones. In the past, he had yearned for the battlefield. He thought that the battlefield was hot-blooded and that countless people would flock to it. But now, after a defeat, he finally understood the coldness and pain under such hot-bloodedness. Jiangxia was a small city. Yili and the others temporarily lived in General Yuan Pei's mansion. The so-called general's mansion was actually just a medium-sized courtyard in Jiangxia City. Veteran generals like Yuan Pei and Zhang Qilan were definitely not inferior to the Defender General of the state, Murong Xin, and the others. However, because they were generals of the Mo army, they were oppressed indefinitely, and could never truly obtain the glory and honor that should have belonged to them. Because of Yi Li's arrival, Yuan Pei moved his wife and children from the main courtyard to the side courtyard in the backyard. Understanding Yuan Pei's intentions and loyalty to the Prince Ding mansion, Yi Li didn't refuse and casually chose a room to live in. She didn't have time to tidy up. After casually freshening up, she went to the front hall to discuss the war with everyone. When Yi Li stepped into the study, it was already full of people. They were discussing something intensely and didn't quiet down until Yi Li came in. Yuan Pei personally went forward to invite Yi Li to sit in the main seat. After Yi Li sat down, he tidied up his clothes and bowed solemnly. "Thank you, Princess Consort, for saving my life." Yi Li sighed helplessly and motioned for Zhuo Jing, who was standing beside her, to come forward and help Yuan Pei up. "General Yuan, there's no need for these formalities. Stand up and speak," Yi Li said seriously. Yuan Pei stood up and returned to his seat. Reporting to Princess Consort, Shi Ling has stationed 300,000 soldiers outside Jiangxia. They are clearly determined to take Jiangxia. I've received news that the armies in the north and south are faintly drawing closer to Jiangxia. Once the three armies converge, there will be close to 500,000 soldiers surrounding Jiangxia. Even though our army is brave, Jiangxia is small and the people are weak. We lack military supplies. At that time, I'm afraid we won't be able to resist the siege of 500,000 soldiers. Princess Consort, please make early plans. Yi Li nodded and said, "Thank you, General Yuan, for your reminder. I know what to do. As for the issue of rations, there's no need to worry. The imperial court will naturally send enough rations. Marquis Nan, Shitsi Mu, don't you think so? Marquis Nan was a little absent-minded. When he heard Yi Li's words, he raised his head and smiled faintly. Princess Consort is right. We are going through fire and water on the battlefield. The imperial court and the emperor will naturally not mistreat the soldiers on the front lines. Chapter 318. Yi Li looked at Marquis Nan and clearly saw the exhaustion and sadness in his eyes. She didn't know what Ling Qingyu said to him, but she could roughly guess because there was still no news of Marquis Nan's heir. It was hard not to have some bad thoughts about it. She glanced at Marquis Nan worriedly, and Marquis Nan nodded at her to indicate that he was fine. Despite Marquis Nan's statement, everyone's expressions still didn't improve. After so many years, the Mahist army no longer had much hope for that person in the palace. Yi Li saw everyone's expression, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she turned around and discussed the war with the generals. After the discussion, everyone took their leave. Marquis Nan still sat in his seat without moving. Yi Li originally thought that Marquis Nan had something to say, but when everyone left, she realized that Marquis Nan was just in a daze. She frowned slightly and called out worriedly, "Marquis." Marquis Nan's eyes were blank, and it took him a while to recover. He still looked at Yi Li in a daze and said slowly, "Princess Consort, sorry to disturb you. This Marquis will also take his leave." Yi Li shook her head and said, "Marquis Nan, the heir's identity is different. No news is good news now. There are many important matters in the army that require Marquis Nan's decision." Marquis Nan forced a smile and looked up at Yi Li. The old duke once said that Princess Consort is an extraordinary person. This Marquis has seen it all along the way. I still have to trouble Princess Consort with all the matters in the army. This Marquis is afraid that I can't do it. Marquis Nan, Yi Li still wanted to say something, but Marquis Nan waved his hand and said, "This Marquis will take his leave first. Princess Consort should also rest early." Watching Marquis Nan walk out of the door, Yi Li finally swallowed her words. "Marquis Nan, take care." Late at night, Yi Li strolled along the winding corridor in the study. She looked up at the silver moon in the sky and frowned slightly. Soon, it would be the night of the next full moon. However, there was still no news of Mo Xiaoyao, who had gone to the northern tribes. She could not help but worry. Furthermore, Marquis Nan had already made it clear that he did not wish to take charge. This was the first time in her life that she was leading an army of hundreds of thousands. She was not as calm and confident as she appeared. "Xiaoyao, where are you now?" "Who?" "Come out." Under the moonlight, Yi Li suddenly came back to her senses and pointed at the end of the corridor behind her. After a while, a tall figure walked out from the corner. Yi Li was slightly taken aback. She raised her brows and narrowed her cold eyes. Mu, what are you doing here so late at night?" Mu Yang's expression was somewhat complicated as he looked at Yi Li's hand that was facing him. That pair of slender jade-like hands concealed a murderous intent. Mu Yang coughed lightly. "This one did not mean to offend. Please forgive me for disturbing Princess." Yi Li smiled faintly and calmly withdrew her hand into her sleeve. She raised her hand and stroked the hair by her ear. "It's so late. Mu, do you have something to say?" A surprised expression flashed across Mu Yang's face. Very quickly, Mu Yang smiled faintly. "Princess is indeed quick-witted. This one is just, has Marquis Nan agreed to hand over the decision-making power of the army to Princess?" Yi Li raised her brows and smiled faintly. Mu may be the heir of Marquis Muyang, but you are not Marquis Muyang himself. Furthermore, even Marquis Muyang does not have the right to intervene in the military matters. Mu, you are only Marquis Nan, a lieutenant under the deputy commander of the army. Towards Yi Li's obvious contempt, Mu Yang did not get angry. He leaned against the railing of the corridor with his hands behind his back. This one thinks that Princess knows the true meaning and function of this one's lieutenant status. Yi Li raised her brows and smiled. So what? Marquis Nan's heart is broken. Marquis Nan's heir's life and death is unknown. He is unable to command the army. Now that the Xiling army is at the city gates, what does Lieutenant Mu think we should do? Facing the calmness of the woman in front of him, Mu Yang could not help but feel helpless and tired from the bottom of his heart. Of course, he understood Princess Ding's meaning. It was already difficult for Marquis Nan to control the Mahist army with his identity. Not to mention that he did not even have the time to change the commander. Although he had the identity of heir, he only had the military position of a lieutenant. Not to mention commanding the Mahist army, even if he wanted to lead a part of the Mahist army, without Princess Ding's approval, no one would accept it. Mu Yang was never a person who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Therefore, he did not have any plans to seize control of the Mahist army. However, the woman standing in front of him was clearly a woman who was not even 20 years old. But the aura and sharpness in her movements made him, a man of 7 feet, unable to help but admire her. This kind of woman had completely surpassed the meaning and scope of a woman in Mu Yang's understanding. It was as if she did not need to rely on anyone, and no one could stop her. No one could stand in front of her. Mu Yang suddenly thought of the handsome man who was still elegant and calm even when sitting in a wheelchair. In this world, only that kind of man could match this kind of woman. Mu. Yi Li looked at the person who was looking at her and frowned. Mu Yang came back to his senses and smiled apologetically. Princess has misunderstood this one's meaning. This one did not intend to make things difficult for Princess. Yi Li raised her brows, but smiled without saying anything. Mu Yang said, right now, Prince Li's rebellion in the south has not been quelled, and Xiling is invading. In the north, the northern tribes are eyeing covetously. The only ones who can wipe out the enemy are the king's household and the Mahist army. Although Mu Yang is not talented, but I know that the world is most important. Why should I make things difficult for Princess? Yi Li looked at him and smiled faintly. Mu is not making things difficult for this consort. Aren't you afraid that the person in the palace will make things difficult for you? Mu Yang laughed heartily. Many thanks for Princess's concern. This one naturally knows. But there is a small matter that I hope Princess will agree to. Mu, speak frankly. Mu Yang pondered for a moment and said, this one does not know if my father and the Ding King's household have any unpleasant past. I only hope that Princess will give this one face and be magnanimous. Yi Li was surprised and sighed after a long time. Marquis Mu Yang has a good son. With a son like this, Marquis Mu Yang should be satisfied for life. All right, this consort promises you. Mu Yang cupped his hands and said, many thanks, Princess. Yi Li shook her head. Mu does not need to thank me. This consort is not at a disadvantage in making this deal with Mu. After all, compared to the matters on the battlefield, the other small grudges are nothing. Mu Yang chuckled in a low voice, hearing Wang Fei's words, this one feels ashamed and unable to show his face. Yi Li smiled. It's my slip of the tongue. Mu, please do not blame me. It's getting late. Mu should rest early. Princess, please wait. Mu Yang impatiently said, Princess, may I ask? Do you have any news about Yaoji? Yi Li turned around in surprise. Under the moonlight, she could clearly see the undisguised worry and longing on the man's face. Yi Li shook her head and looked at the disappointment that flashed across Mu Yang's face. She softly said, Mu, some people and some things are missed. Chapter 319. Mu Yang stared at her unwillingly. How do you know that it can't be reunited? Yili said, I don't know if there is such a thing as a broken mirror being reunited, but, the bronze mirror, even if it is reunited, it can't cover up the previous crack. Also, does Shitzi really have a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang's face showed a trace of frustration and annoyance. Yili didn't say anything else and turned to leave. She lightly recited, I once worried too much about love-harming Fan Xing, but when I entered the mountain, I feared that I would lose a city. Is there a way to get the best of both worlds, to live up to Tathagata and Qing? Is there a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang softly recited with a faint bitter smile on his lips. He would never be able to convince Yaoji to become a concubine of Marquis Mu Yang's household, just like he would never be able to convince his proud parents to accept Yaoji as their daughter-in-law. Live up to Tathagata and Qing. Did the person who wrote this poem also experience the same struggle and pain as him? The next morning, the Shilling army didn't attack again, which was rare. Yili sat in the study and sorted out the news and analysis of the battle. Marquis Nan didn't say that he couldn't do anything to decline. Early in the morning, when Yili just got up, someone came to report that Marquis Nan was seriously ill. Although there weren't any famous doctors in Jiangxi City, fortunately, the medical skills of the Mo family army's military doctors were extremely good. They quickly went over to diagnose and treat the Marquis and reported back to Yili. Although the southern Marquis wasn't very old, he had been living like a prince all year round. Therefore, he was too tired and anxious during the march, which caused him to suddenly fall ill. Helpless, Yili could only send people to take care of him and speed up the search for Marquis Nan's heir. Qin Feng just finished his mission and secretly returned to Jiangxia last night. Yili called him to the study early in the morning and told him to look for Marquis Nan's heir. Princess, Officer Yun is fighting with someone at the military field. Just as she was talking to Qin Feng, someone rushed in from outside the door to report. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled. She turned to Qin Feng and Zhuojing and said, We have been on the road for several days. Yesterday we had a big fight, but this morning we were able to get up and fight. It seems that we have underestimated the abilities of our Mahist army. Zhuojing rubbed his nose and laughed in a low voice. He said, Wang Fei is right. Yili rose and rubbed her shoulders. She said, Since that's the case, let's go take a look. Because it was the time when the two armies were facing each other, the Mahist army's barracks were stationed in an open space not far from Jiangxi City. All around, there were soldiers guarding the roads. An empty space in the middle of the barracks was used as a temporary drill ground. By the time Yili and the others arrived, Yun Ting was already wrestling with a young general of similar age. There were also a few high-ranking Mahist army generals and many soldiers standing at the side. Mu Yang, who had been watching from the side, was the first to see Yili come in. He turned his head and smiled at her. Yili nodded slightly. Qin Feng and Zhuojing parted the crowd to make a path. Everyone looked at the two young but outstanding generals fighting fiercely. Many people didn't even notice that Yili had walked to the front. Wang Fei. It was Mu Yang who spoke. The people who had been watching from the side finally recovered. Their expressions changed slightly as they hurriedly bowed to Yili. Some people wanted to go forward and pull the two people apart. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, No matter. Let's wait until they have decided the victor. Although Yili said so, with the presence of the princess consort, the bustling and lively atmosphere in the school ground suddenly dissipated. Many people had awkward and reserved expressions on their faces. Yili didn't care. She smiled and turned to ask Mu Yang, who was standing next to her, Mu Shitzi, who do you think has a better chance of winning? Mu Yang smiled and raised an eyebrow as he said, "This one thinks that Field Officer Yunting has a better chance." Instantly, the generals beside him all revealed unconvinced expressions. One of them had already blurted out, "From what I see, Field Commandant Qin is still more powerful." When he said this, everyone saw that there wasn't any displeasure on Yili's face. They couldn't help but feel relieved. They all spoke out in support of the young field officer surnamed Qin. Mu Yang said in a low voice to Yili with a smile, "Wang Fei, it seems that the Mahist army is also very xenophobic." Yunting was also a member of the Mahist army, and he was one that Princess Ding had personally cultivated. But after all, he was a newbie who came out of nowhere. Soldiers were all proud and arrogant. Naturally, there were many people who didn't like him. Yili didn't care. She smiled faintly and said, "In the military camp, the strong are the kings. It's not a bad thing to occasionally learn from each other. As long as it doesn't affect the important matters, it's fine." When she was in the special forces in her previous life, any random soldier was the elite of the military. How could there be no competition when such a group of elites were squeezed together? And it was because of this competition that they worked harder to move forward. Because the weak would be eliminated in the end. For the same reason, many of the generals in the Mahist army were promoted from ordinary soldiers. There were also some who had served the Ding king's household for generations. Although Yunting had made contributions in the Battle of Yonglin, it wasn't worth mentioning to the soldiers of the Mahist army. Not to mention that he was promoted by her, the Wang Fei, who didn't know the depth of his abilities. Mu Yang deeply looked at Yili and chuckled softly, "Wang Fei is right." The two people who were fighting in the middle of the field finally noticed that something was wrong with the onlookers outside. As soon as they looked back, they saw Yili standing on the side and looking at them with interest. Yunting's face was embarrassed. For a moment, he was careless and was punched by the other side. However, the other side still had a sense of awe for the princess consort of Ding. After they succeeded, they no longer entangled. The two people quickly separated. They just stared at each other to let people know that they were still very dissatisfied with each other. Yili raised her hand and high-fived. She looked at the two with a smile and said, "Why did you stop?" "Wang Fei." Yunting lowered his head in shame. In the past few months, he had been convinced by Princess Ding. He was also proud of being able to be promoted and cultivated by the Wang Fei. Therefore, when faced with the contemptuous attitude of several young generals in the Mahist army, he was so easily angered that he actually fought with them in a fit of anger. Yili smiled and said, "It's okay. It's common for everyone to learn from each other in the military camp. Don't be embarrassed. Or, is Ben Fei hindering you from playing?" As soon as these words came out, the several generals standing on the side couldn't help blushing. If they didn't have doubts about Yunting and even about Wang Fei's ability, they wouldn't have let the two people fight like this. Now, looking at Wang Fei's attitude, it seemed that these 7-foot men were narrow-minded. Yili saw that they didn't intend to fight, so she smiled and waved her hand to let the soldiers around her disperse. She took several generals to the big tent in the military camp. Right now, Lu Jingxian was in charge of the military camp outside the city. However, he had gone into the city early in the morning to discuss the defense with the guards in the city. He wasn't in the camp, so no one cared when the two field officers fought. Lu Jingxian had hurried back as soon as he received the news in the city, but he was still a step slower than Yili. He could only glare at Field Officer Qin with a dark face and go forward to ask for forgiveness. Chapter 320. Yili's laughter was clear and melodious. She raised a hand to indicate for Zhuo Jing to help Lu Jingxian up. She smiled and said, "General Lu, you don't have to be like this. Young people only need to know their limits. Just treat fighting as bonding." The group of people returned to the large tent and sat down. Lu Jingxian called Field Officer Qin in front of him to ask about the reason for the fight. It was not a rare thing to fight in the military, but if they wanted to fight, they could do it on the practice field or the arena. It was not proper to fight in front of normal soldiers regardless of the situation. It was easy for the soldiers to think that the relationship between the generals was not good. Field Officer Qin glanced sideways at Yunting and snorted lightly. He did not respond to Lu Jingxian's words. Yunting was once again provoked by his snort of disdain. He raised his chin and said, "You don't agree. If you don't agree, we can fight again." Field Officer Qin smiled coldly and said with a raised eyebrow, "You think he is afraid of you? If it wasn't for, you would beat you until you were looking for your teeth on the ground. Boasting shamelessly, aren't you afraid of the wind biting your tongue?" Yunting mocked. "Shut up." Lu Jingxian was furious. It was one thing for two field officers to fight in front of so many generals and Princess Ding, but they were cursing in public. They had no regard for the law. Yili put down the teacup in her hand and said with a faint smile to Lu Jingxian, "General Lu, calm down. It is inevitable that young people are young and impetuous. General does not need to be angry." Yunting, after staying in Jing for a few months, to say nothing else, your mouth has become much sharper. Yunting's face twisted. He was considered young in the military, but he was still a few years older than Dingguo Wangfei. Being called young and impetuous by Princess Ding, who was younger than him, he couldn't help but feel his face heat up. He lowered his head and said, "This subordinate has been rash. Wang Fei, please punish me." Ben Fei said, "I don't blame you, so I don't blame you." Yili said, "Why don't you tell me why the two of you are, sparring so early in the morning?" Commandant Chen and Yunting had a rare moment of hesitation. They looked at Yili without saying anything. Yili frowned. "What? Can't he say it? Or should I ask the generals who were present?" Field Officer Chen took a step forward and gritted his teeth. "This subordinate should not have spoken disrespectfully to Wang Fei, so I had a conflict with Field Officer Yun. Wang Fei, please punish me. This subordinate is willing to accept any punishment." Yili stared at him for a moment and then nodded, saying, "You dare to take responsibility for your actions." Commandant Chen remained silent. Yunting looked at everyone and also took a step forward. "This subordinate is also in the wrong. I'm willing to be punished together with Commandant Chen." Looking at Yunting's young face, Yili nodded inwardly. There were benefits to learning and teaching for a few months. If it was a few months ago, with Yunting's personality, he definitely would not ask for punishment at this time. There was no other reason other than that he understood how to conduct himself better. The Mahist army were not unreasonable people. Seeing Yunting say this, their expressions became much better. After a moment of silence, Yili said in a light voice, "Ben Fei has just taken control of the Mahist army and has not met any of the generals before. It is understandable that everyone is dissatisfied. Therefore, this matter will be let go. Right now, if anyone here still has any dissatisfaction, you can speak it out. Everyone here is a true hero who has fought on the battlefield for many years. Let's not learn from those roundabout things in the imperial court." Seeing that everyone was hesitating, Yili smiled and said, "In this tent, the one who speaks is not guilty. If you have any thoughts, speak. Or are you all afraid that Ben Fei will retaliate after this?" Everyone was silent for a while. A middle-aged deputy general stood up and raised his hands towards Yili, saying, "Wang Fei, please forgive us. The original Master I is not here, so it is natural that Wang Fei is in command of the Mahist army. But war is not like anything else. It is the lives of tens of thousands of brothers. Therefore, this subordinate has thought more. Wang Fei is still young and was born into a scholarly family. This. Yili listened to her subordinate's words and nodded with a smile to show that she understood. The other people saw that she did not show any signs of anger and gathered their courage to stand and voice their doubts. It was just that Yili was still young and they had doubts about Yili's ability to lead troops and skills. Yili sat in the chair and silently waited for everyone to finish speaking. Then she smiled brightly and said, Ben Fei only now knows that the generals have so many worries. It really is Ben Fei's fault. Field Officer Qin, is it because of this that you are dissatisfied with Ben Fei? Field Officer Qin stiffened his neck and said, war is not child's play. If Wang Fei doesn't have true ability, this little general will naturally be dissatisfied. Chen Yun, impudent. Lu Jingxian shouted. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, no matter. Ben Fei specializes in dealing with dissatisfaction. How about we go to the school field first to see who is better? This subordinate does not dare. Field Officer Chen Yun was clearly frightened by Yili's words and knelt on the ground with a thump. The generals of the Mahist army might have doubts about Wang Fei's ability to lead the Mahist army, but they were still very respectful of her status as the Ding Wang Fei. Chapter 321. Chen Yun flipped and quickly retreated to a safe distance. Yili did not chase after him. She put away her sword and stood in the middle of the field to look at him. Chen Yun raised his hands and said, this subordinate has eyes but cannot see. Wang Fei, please forgive this subordinate. This subordinate dares to ask Wang Fei to redo the match. Finishing, he walked to the weapon rack at the side and took down a long spear. Shaking it in his hand, he stared at Yili with a serious expression. Yili nodded in satisfaction and said, very good, this is right. Field Officer Qin, please. Excuse me. Chen Yun said loudly. The long spear in his hand stabbed straight at Yili. Yili nimbly stepped out of the way and the long sword in her hand danced beautifully. It was said that an inch longer was an inch stronger. The 3-chi long sword in Yili's hand did not have any advantage against the long spear in Chen Yun's hand. But the people below the stage quickly found that Wang Fei had kept the distance between the two within a certain range. And this distance greatly limited the advantage of the long spear in Chen Yun's movements. For a time, they were evenly matched. Below the stage, Feng Zhiyao, who had arrived at an unknown time, lazily stood beside Mu Yang with his arms crossed. He asked with a grin, young Master Mu, who do you think will win between Princess Consort and Field Officer Qin? Mu Yang smiled faintly and said, this subordinate has had the fortune to see Princess Ding's skills. She is definitely a 1 in 10,000 expert. Field Officer Qin. I'm afraid he is still lacking a bit. Hearing Mu Yang's words, Lu Jingxian, who was at the side, turned his head to look at the two of them in surprise. Finally, his gaze fell on Feng Zhiyao. Feng Zhiyao and Lu Jingxian were old acquaintances. He did not hide it and said with a chuckle, General Lu may not know, but Wang Fei's swordsmanship was personally taught by the prince. Also, Wang Fei is most likely the worst at swordsmanship. Hearing this, the expressions of the generals changed slightly. They had all seen Wang Fei's swordsmanship. It was not the best, but they could faintly see the murderous intent under the edge of the sword. That was a sword technique that could truly kill people, and this was said to be the one that Princess Consort was the least skilled in. In other words, Wang Fei and Chen Yun did not use their true skills. Mu Yang raised his head and looked at the graceful figure on the stage. He couldn't help but chuckle. He suddenly remembered what Yili had just said. Ai's imperial concubine specialized in dealing with all kinds of disobedience. In front of such a woman, how many people could truly be disobedient? On the stage, the two of them fought with great agility, and it was hard to tell who had the upper hand. Yi Li's 3 feet long sword was like a poisonous snake, attacking Chen Yun's vital points. Chen Yun was not willing to be outdone. His long spear danced in a watertight manner, and the two of them were in a deadlock for a while. Yi Li looked at the young general who had a serious expression on his face and smiled faintly. The long sword in his hand turned into a cold rainbow that shot straight towards Chen Yun's face. Chen Yun hurriedly waved his spear to block, but he saw the long sword that had been heading towards him turn midway and move along the body of the spear. Chen Yun only paused for a moment before he felt a chill on his neck. The tip of Yi Li's sword was already at his throat, but her other hand was tightly gripping the body of his spear. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and said with a slight smile, "Field Officer Qin." Chen Yun put down his spear and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei's swordsmanship is profound. This subordinate admits defeat." Yi Li did not make things difficult for him. She took back her long sword and threw it to Zhuo Jing, who was standing on the side of the stage. She turned and smiled at the generals below the stage. "Which other general is dissatisfied? Why don't you come up and try?" The generals looked at each other. A burly middle-aged man holding a pair of maces jumped onto the stage. He raised his hands in a bow and said, "This subordinate is Deputy General Lu Feng of the Maoist Army's Qizhou. Please teach me Wang Fei's skills." Yi Li nodded slightly and took 2 steps back. This General Lu was not like Chen Yun, who was slender and agile. With a glance, it was clear that he was a power-type opponent. Looking at his pair of maces, it was at least a few dozen caddies. It would not be comfortable to be hit by such a weapon. Yi Li was not a person who liked to flaunt her superiority, so she took out the dagger she was most comfortable with. Lu Feng looked with surprise at the dagger in Yi Li's hand that flashed with cold light. He said, "This is Wang Fei's weapon?" Yi Li nodded and said, "General Lu, please. Then this subordinate will offend you. Wang Fei, be careful." After Lu Feng finished speaking, one of his maces swept towards Yi Li. Yi Li quickly moved out of the way. The dagger in her hand flashed with an icy light in the morning light. The people below the stage clearly found that when Yi Li had a dagger in her hand, she was clearly more dangerous than when she was holding a long sword. There were many times when Yi Li's dagger had narrowly missed Lu Feng's vital points. If it wasn't for Lu Feng's great strength, each of his moves containing an unstoppable force that forced her to dodge, Lu Feng would have been injured by that small dagger. Yi Li clearly understood Lu Feng's strengths and weaknesses. So she did not fight Lu Feng head-on. She used the advantage of her body to continuously exhaust Lu Feng's strength. At the same time, she waited for a chance to attack. Even though she did not succeed in injuring Lu Feng, she did succeed in giving him a great scare. Once again, Lu Feng raised his pair of maces and swung them towards Yi Li. Yi Li dodged to the side. She kicked in the air and her left hand slapped the ground. The dagger in her right hand went straight for Lu Feng's left shoulder. Seeing this, Lu Feng hurriedly raised his right mace. Yi Li had already flipped behind him. "General Lu." Lu Feng's body froze. The cold dagger was pressed against his back. Lu Feng had fought for many years and naturally had seen all kinds of injuries. At the same time, he knew that if Yi Li's stab was solid, he would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Putting down the pair of maces, Lu Feng turned and bowed to Yi Li, saying, "Many thanks for Wang Fei's mercy. This general is convinced." Yi Li smiled slightly and said, "General Lu's strength is unmatched and his skills are not ordinary. Ben Fei is also very impressed." There was a moment of silence below the stage. Suddenly, there was a burst of cheers. The soldiers present all cheered. After winning 2 rounds in a row, the generals were completely convinced of Yi Li's skills. Naturally, they did not challenge her again. Yi Li had already won 2 rounds in a row. If she went up again, even if she won, it would be an unfair victory. It would be a waste of the reputation of a group of men taking turns to fight against a woman. Seeing Yili walk down the stage, everyone quickly went up. Lu Jingxian cupped his hands and said with a smile, Wang Fei's display of skills today has truly made this subordinate prostrate in admiration. Us rough people don't know the rules and have offended Wang Fei. I hope Wang Fei will not blame us. Yili smiled and said, General Lu is too serious. There's no need to take these small matters to heart. Ben Fei still has some matters to take care of in the city. I'll have to trouble General Lu to take care of the barracks. Lu Jingxian quickly replied, Wang Fei can be at ease. Yili nodded and looked at Yun Ting with a smile as she said, Commandant Yun. Yun Ting rubbed his head and said with a bitter face, Wang Fei, this subordinate knows his wrongs. Yili nodded in satisfaction and said with a smile, knowing one's wrongs and being able to change is the greatest virtue. Have you been reading recently? Thinking of the days when Wang Fei had just sent him to the Mahist army and the mountain of books in his room that was even taller than a person, the smile on Yunting's face became even more bitter. I've read. I just read, Military Strategy. Yili's smile became even more amiable, your progress is not bad. Ben Fei just happened to need a few military strategy books to teach the soldiers. I'll have to trouble Commandant Yun to make 10 copies and give them to me in 3 days. Yes, Wang Fei. Yun Ting's eyes were blank and his body was stiff. His expression was dazed as he watched Yili turn and leave. Chapter 322. Brother, what's wrong? Chen Yun looked at his mournful appearance and patted his shoulder as he asked. Yun Ting silently looked at him, then turned around and left. If I continue to fight with you, I will be a pig. Chen Yun looked doubtfully at his back as he walked away in a daze. Then, he looked at his own hands in confusion. It was just a fight, there was no need to be so petty, right? Feng Jia walked forward, tapped his shoulder with the fan in his hand and said with a smile, You don't need to mind. That kid is really annoyed at copying books. If Lieutenant Chen has nothing to do, you can help him write a few pages. I guarantee that he will treat you as his life's brother. Copying books. Chen Yun's face twisted a little, thinking of when he was young, he was chased by his father and teacher to copy books. He quickly shook his head, forget it. I will go and see if there is anything to eat. When Lieutenant Yun is tired of copying, I will send it to him to make up for it. As for copying books, there was no need, his handwriting could not be seen by others. When they left the city, they were in a hurry, but when they went back, they were not in a hurry. Yili's group strolled, taking the opportunity to look at the various checkpoints and the situation of the people. Although the war was imminent, the people of Jiangxia seemed to be very at ease. They were methodically living their own lives, as if there was no difference. Even if they had just experienced a bloody battle yesterday, and almost lost the city. Early in the morning, the people were still going out, opening their shops, there was no fear and uneasiness in their eyes. Feng Jia walked beside Yili, fanning himself while explaining to Yili, these people completely trust the Mahist army, they believe that as long as the Mahist army is there, the city will not be lost, their homes will not be invaded by the enemy. Yili sighed softly. She did not know whether to be impressed or worried. To be able to let the people have such confidence in them, the Mahist army should be proud. But, when everyone had entrusted their trust and responsibility to the Mahist army, relying on them, this was a heavy pressure. It was no wonder that the successive masters of the Ding King's Fu were unable to let go of everything and retire. It was because the Ding King's Fu and the Mahist army had long become the spiritual and practical pillars of the Dechu state. If one day the Mahist army was no longer the Mahist army, would the Dechu state still be the Dechu state? Your Highness, the emissary from West Hill wishes to see you. As soon as she walked to the entrance of the mansion, General Yuan Pei was already waiting for her. When he saw Yi Li and the others return, he hurriedly came forward to report. Yi Li frowned slightly and said, "A messenger from West Hill." Yuan Pei nodded solemnly and said, "Just now, the West Hill emissary requested to see you outside the city. This subordinate acted on my own initiative and let them in. Right now, they are waiting in the outer courtyard for your highness to summon them." Yi Li nodded and said, "General Yuan did well. Let's go see this West Hill emissary." To have the courage to enter Jiangxia at this time, they must not be ordinary people. Invite them to the study. Yes. Yi Li changed her clothes and returned to the study. After a while, General Yuan Pei led the West Hill emissary in. The leader was a middle-aged man with an ordinary face. Behind him was a general and 3 attendants. The group of 5 were all dressed in cloth and did not have swords. They seemed to be very confident and were not afraid to step into the city controlled by the Mahist army. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Li and stepped forward to cup his hands. "I am a guest of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon. Mo Fei greets Princess Ding of Eastern Chu. Mr. Mo, please rise." Yi Li gently raised her hand and said with a smile, "What brings Mr. Mo here?" Mo Fei looked at the people sitting in the study and said with a smile, "Indeed, Genom of Gojoseon has some small matters to consult your highness. But I wonder if I can speak with your highness alone." Yi Li smiled and said, "It's not that I can't, but it's not necessary. As the temporary commander of the Mahist army, it is inappropriate for me to speak with the enemy emissary in private. Besides, there is nothing that cannot be said. If Mr. Mo has something to say, please say it face to face." On the side, Zhuo Jing sneered and said, "Speak in private. Who knows if you are waiting for an opportunity to assassinate our princess?" Feng Zhiyao smiled lazily and said, "I'm afraid we don't have the ability to assassinate your highness. But we must guard against others." Mo Fei's expression was ugly and he wanted to flare up, but he quickly suppressed it. He looked up at Yi Li and said, "Since your highness has said so, I will not force you. Presumably, the people here are your highness and the Ding Palace's trusted aides." Yi Li nodded indifferently. Mo Fei said, "Our prince has a letter for your highness. Please take a look." After that, he took out a letter from his sleeve and presented it. Zhuo Jing took the letter and opened it. After making sure there was no problem, he turned and handed it to Yi Li. Yi Li opened the letter and glanced at it. She looked up at Mo Fei who was standing leisurely in the hall and smiled faintly. She lowered her head and continued to read. After a while, she looked up and slowly folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She calmly looked at Mo Fei. Mo Fei smiled and said, "Your Highness, what do you think about what your Highness said by the prince? What do you think?" Yi Li smiled and looked at him leisurely. She said slowly, "Come, drag this person out and behead him." Everyone was stunned. Yuan Pei looked at Feng Zhiyao. Feng Zhiyao looked sideways at Su Qingze who was sitting on the side reading a book. Maybe because Feng Zhiyao's gaze was too intense, Su Qingze who usually did not speak put down his book and looked up at Yi Li. He said, "Little sister, the envoys are not to be killed in a battle between 2 armies." Yi Li smiled faintly, "Thank you for the reminder." "Then Mr. Mo, will you walk out yourself or will I order people to throw you out?" Mo Fei looked at the crowd and sneered, "So this is how your highness of Ding country treats her guests?" Yi Li said indifferently, "Those who come are guests. I will naturally treat them as distinguished guests. But if they are thieves, I won't be polite, right?" Mo Fei raised his eyebrows and looked at her. He said, "Will your highness really not consider our prince's proposal?" Yi Li looked down at him indifferently. Her lips curved into an extremely cold smile. "Mr. Mo, do you really think I won't kill you?" The smile on Mo Fei's face became slightly stiff. Since he could be sent as an envoy of Genom of Gojosian to see Yili, he naturally had some ability. How could he not see the murderous intent and coldness hidden in the eyes of this beautiful woman in green? Mo Fei forced a smile and nodded. He said, I understand. Since that is the case, I will leave first. Finishing, Mo Fei raised his hands in salute to Yili and turned to walk out. He had thought that coming to Jiangxia City this time would be an easy matter. After all, no matter how high her position was, she was still a woman. Everything she had was based on Prince Ding. Mo Fei did not think much of her. But he did not expect that Princess Ding would not give him the slightest chance. She did not even give him a chance to say what he wanted to say before hurriedly retreating. Yili stared at his retreating figure. She smiled faintly and said, Stop him. Before she finished speaking, two figures appeared at the door, one on the left and one on the right, blocking Mo Fei's path. Mo Fei's eyes jumped. He turned to stare at Yili and said harshly, Wang Fei, what is the meaning of this? Yili smiled and said, If Sir Mo wants to leave, please go ahead. As for Genom of Gojosian, I'm afraid I will have to trouble you to stay for a while. Mo Fei's expression changed slightly. He forced a smile and said, What Genom of Gojosian? Is Wang Fei joking? As soon as Yili's words left her mouth, everyone in the room immediately looked at the four people following Mo Fei with vigilance. The tall and burly general ignored them and locked his gaze on the three attendants. Feng Zhiyao, Yuan Pei, and Qin Feng quickly changed their positions. Zhuo Jing inadvertently moved closer to Su Qingze. Yili smiled and stared at one of the men. She said, His Highness Genom of Gojosian, since you have come, why hide? Chapter 323. A moment later, unbridled laughter sounded in the room. The tall man standing in the middle, dressed in the attire of an attendant, casually wiped his face. His ordinary appearance instantly changed. Genom of Gojosian was in his early 50s this year. His appearance was 70 to 80% similar to Lei Dingfeng, but he had more grace and dominance. However, the way he looked at Yili made her feel extremely uncomfortable. As long as one was a man, they would be able to understand what that flash of light meant. Anger and killing intent flashed across the faces of Feng Zhiyao and the others. Yili was not angry. She had seen all kinds of people in her previous life. This degree was not enough for her to lose her cool. She looked indifferently at Genom of Gojosian, who was laughing wildly, and did not speak. When Genom of Gojosian finally seemed to have finished laughing, he walked to a chair at the side and sat down. Mo Fei and the other three stood respectfully behind him. Even though he was dressed in the attire of a servant, it was difficult to conceal his domineering aura. How did Wang Fei see through it? Such good eyesight. I admire you, Genom of Gojosian said curiously. Yili smiled. Zhuo Jing, has this Fei ever taught you what the most important thing to do if you want to disguise yourself? Zhuo Jing replied in a low voice, ordinary and unremarkable. Unnoticeable. Genom of Gojosian raised an eyebrow and said, I can't think of any flaws. Zhuo Jing looked at Genom of Gojosian and then raised his head to look at Yili. Yili nodded slightly. Zhuo Jing said, a person with a disability is not suited to disguise himself. Everyone's gaze immediately focused on Genom of Gojosian's left arm. Everyone knew that Genom of Gojosian had been defeated by Mo Lufang more than a decade ago and had only managed to survive after losing an arm. Originally, no one had paid much attention to it, but now that their attention was focused on his arm, those with good eyesight immediately noticed that something was wrong. Genom of Gojosian had not moved his left arm. His left hand was hidden in his sleeve. Although the sleeves weren't empty, it still made people feel that they were too stiff if they took a closer look. After all, no matter what it was, even if the shape was the same, it could never replace the texture of a real arm. Jenim of Gojosian's expression hardened and the corners of his eyes twitched. Shuo Jing's words had touched his sore spot. Being defeated by Mo Lufang was a shadow and humiliation that he would never be able to forget. However, Mo Lufang had been dead for a long time. In the eyes of the world, he would always be left with the impression that Enchanting, the king of South guarding Xiling, was inferior to Mo Lufang. Therefore, he placed more importance on how to defeat the Mahist army and Mo Xiuyao. Because this was the only way he could wash away his humiliation. Good, Princess Ding's subordinates are truly capable. A moment later, Jenim of Gojosian said in a deep voice. Yili nodded and smiled faintly. Prince praises me too much. Jenim of Gojosian examined Yili and asked, just now, Princess Ding did not hesitate to reject Ai's letter. Will you reconsider now? Yili held her forehead, shook her head and sighed. I cannot find a reason to reconsider. Jenim of Gojosian laughed brightly. Does Wang Fei think that I is not as good as Mo Xiuyao? Yili tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she shook her head and said, how can that be? At least Prince is older than our prince. Jenim of Gojosian's eyes flashed. As expected, Wang Fei is not an ordinary woman. What if I say that as long as Wang Fei follows I will immediately withdraw my troops from Dongchu? Impudence. Yuan Pei was furious. He slapped the table and stood up, glaring angrily at Jenim of Gojosian. The expressions of the others were not good either. Yili raised a hand to stop Yuan Pei. She smiled faintly and said, for Prince to say this, does he think that Yili's brain is not good? Jenim of Gojosian raised an eyebrow and asked in confusion, why does Wang Fei say this? Yili laughed coldly and said, Xiling's army of hundreds of thousands has invaded our Dechu state and finally reached Jiangxia. It would not be easy for Prince to withdraw his troops now, right? Besides, I feel that rather than humiliating the country in exchange for Prince's withdrawal, it would be more convenient to directly exchange for Prince. Does Prince agree? Hearing this, the expressions of the Xiling's followers changed. The man who looked like a general pulled out his sword with a clang and stood in front of Jenim of Gojosian to protect him. Yili raised an eyebrow and smiled without speaking. Jenim of Gojosian raised his hand and pressed down on the weapon in his subordinate's hand. He said, everyone in this room is an expert. Princess Ding is willing to let you bring your sword in. This means that she is confident that your sword is not a threat. Put it down. That person looked at Yili with some reluctance. In the end, he obeyed Jenim of Gojosian's orders and put away the sword in his hand. Seeing that he was about to become a prisoner, Jenim of Gojosian was clearly not in a hurry. As the host, Yili was naturally not in a hurry. She sat leisurely and drank tea. After a while, Jenim of Gojosian sighed and said, even though I took a risk by coming here today, seeing Wang Fei, I feel that this trip was not in vain. What are Wang Fei's plans? Yili put down her teacup and said, I have said that the others can leave, but I invite Prince to stay for a few days. Jenim of Gojosian shook his head and said, I am busy with military affairs. I am afraid that I will have to disappoint Wang Fei's good intentions. No matter. If Prince feels that you can break out of Jiangxia with just the few of you, then feel free. As you wish. Jenim of Gojosian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He raised his head and said with a smile, how about this, I have someone that Wang Fei might be interested in. This person can be considered a meeting gift for Wang Fei. Yili raised an eyebrow. Her heart moved slightly, but her expression did not change as she looked at him calmly. Jenim of Gojosian did not beat around the bush and said bluntly, the Southern Marquis Shitzi, I heard that he is Wang Fei's brother-in-law. The southern Marquis Shitsi is in Prince of Gojoseon's hands. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled but did not speak. Yili asked, how can I trust Prince of Gojoseon? Jenim of Gojoseon said, I can let Wang Fei meet him first. Seeing him like this, Yili knew that there was an 80% chance that the southern Marquis Shitsi was in Jenim of Gojoseon's hands. The same question arose. Should she use Jenim of Gojoseon to exchange for the southern Marquis Shitsi? After a long silence, Yili finally raised her head and said, all right, when I see the southern Marquis Shitsi, this Fei will immediately let Prince of Gojoseon out of the city. It's a deal. She sent people to take Jenim of Gojoseon and the others away. The study instantly exploded. Yuan Pei anxiously asked, Wang Fei, using Jenim of Gojoseon to exchange for the southern Marquis Shitsi, isn't it too? Everyone could see that this was definitely a losing trade. The southern Marquis Shitsi and Jenim of Gojoseon were too different in terms of weight. Yili smiled as she looked at Feng Zhiyao and asked, Feng-san, what do you think? Feng Zhiyao used his fan to point at his chin and thought for a while before saying, Jenim of Gojoseon cannot be killed. Once Jenim of Gojoseon dies, Jiangxia and the places occupied by Xiling will definitely incur Xiling's bloody revenge. Also, the Jenim of Gojoseon's Shitsi, Leitingfeng, who is stationed in Xinyang, is also not an easy character to deal with. If he crazily attacks Jiangxia to avenge his father, we may not be able to hold on. Also, once Jenim of Gojoseon dies, the current balance between the three countries and the imperial court's opinion towards the Mahist army will undergo an unpredictable change. At that time, Also, although the southern Marquis has always been neutral and does not like to involve himself in worldly affairs, he still has some power in the imperial court and the military. If we save the southern Marquis Shitsi, even if the Ding Palace does not have an additional ally, at least they will not be enemies. Chapter 324. Yuan Pei wasn't someone who didn't know the ways of the world. Hearing Feng Zhiyao say this, he thought for a moment before nodding, this general has not thought it through. Wang Fei, please forgive this general. Yili shook her head and said, if we can kill Jenim of Gojoseon, that would be the best. It is a pity that we haven't made the preparations yet. Let him keep his head on his neck for a few days. Everyone couldn't help but laugh when they heard this. Yili quickly put away her smile and said seriously, let's discuss how to get the Nan Marquis Shitsi back. Qin Feng, I'll leave Jenim of Gojoseon to you. Qin Feng nodded and said, Wang Fei, do not worry. I guarantee that not even a strand of hair will be able to touch Jenim of Gojoseon. When the Nan Marquis received the news of his son, he almost immediately ran over to see Yili without caring that he was seriously ill in bed. After he understood what had happened, the Nan Marquis pushed aside the people who were supporting him. He knelt on the ground and respectfully bowed to Yili, saying, Wang Fei's great kindness, the Nan Marquis Fu will never forget. Wang Fei, please accept this old man's bow. Yili stilled and hurriedly left the table to personally help the Nan Marquis up. Marquis, don't do this. Ben Fei doesn't dare. Not to mention the identity of the Nan Marquis Shitsi, Ben Fei can't not save him for Dejia's sake. The Nan Marquis was in tears. Even though the Nan Marquis Shitsi was not the only son of the Nan Marquis Fu, but he was the only son of the Nan Marquis. He was the only heir of the Nan Marquis Fu that could support the entire family. If something happened to him, they could only adopt a successor from the cadet branches. But there weren't any outstanding candidates in the cadet branches. The Nan Marquis Fu would probably only be able to last until the Marquis generation. Quan is useless. He was defeated and captured. He has caused trouble for Wang Fei. It was not a good reputation to be defeated and captured. Marquis Nan did not wish for his son to have outstanding achievements or great power. He only hoped that he could return alive and leave behind some descendants for the Marquis Nan's residence. Yili comforted him softly. Victory and defeat are common in war. Genom of Gojosian of West Hill is known as the god of war of West Hill. It's not shameful for the southern Marquis heir to be defeated by him. As long as he's still alive, he'll win one day. Marquis Nan solemnly thanked her. This old man thanks Princess. Genom of Gojosian had been detained by Jiangxi City in exchange for the southern Marquis heir. This kind of transaction was obviously very advantageous for the West Hill, so after receiving the letter, the West Hill barracks almost immediately agreed without any hesitation. After all, Genom of Gojosian was the commander-in-chief of the Shilling army. If anything happened to him, not only would the Shilling army be leaderless, but the West Hill barracks would also be in chaos. And the southern Marquis heir was just a Marquis heir. Even if the southern Marquis had some prestige in the Chu capital, to the Dechu state army, the southern Marquis heir, who had just entered the battlefield, would have less influence on the Mahist army than a captain. This kind of transaction was unbelievably easy. Both sides quickly made preparations for the exchange of hostages. The location of the exchange was set to be 3 days later in a small valley 5 miles outside of Jiangxi City. Yili only brought Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing, as well as a few specially trained soldiers under Qin Feng and a dozen shadow guard. Even though he was a prisoner, Genom of Gojosian was still as elegant as ever. He was not in a sorry state as a hostage. When he saw Yili, he was even in a good mood and smiled at her. Yili did not pay attention to him. She waved her hand and had people take him away. Compared to Genom of Gojosian, the southern Marquis heir's situation was clearly much worse. The southern Marquis heir was dragged out from behind by the West Hill people. He was covered in wounds and looked tired and dispirited. The leader of the West Hill people was actually the heir of Genom of Gojosian, Ladingfeng, whom she had met several times in West Hill. It was obvious that he had rushed over from Xinyang overnight after receiving the news. Seeing Yili also sitting on a horse, he paused and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, how have you been since we last met?" Yili raised her eyebrows and said indifferently, "Not bad. I could have been very good. It's a pity that the heir and your country refused to give me this opportunity." Lei Dingfeng laughed and said, "Fighting on the battlefield is a man's business. With your status as a princess, you should be living a life of luxury. Why should you meddle in this mundane world?" Yili sighed and said, "I am a mundane person. How can I be detached from the mundane world? Lei, let's stop chatting here. May I ask what is the current situation of the southern Marquis heir?" Lei Dingfeng turned to look at the southern Marquis heir who was being held behind him. He smiled apologetically at Yili and said, "Swords have no eyes on the battlefield. The southern Marquis heir is inevitably injured. I hope Wang Fei will not blame him." Yili smiled faintly and said, "I don't blame him. I understand now. Lei is reminding me that I am too lenient with the captive. Zhuo Jing." She raised her slender hand slightly and made a simple gesture. Zhuo Jing responded and moved like the wind. There were 2 cracking sounds and a scream came from behind. Mo Fei, who was standing beside Genom of Gojosian, had his left arm bent strangely and drooped down. Lei Dingfeng's expression changed slightly. He stared at Yili in front of him like lightning. Yili's expression was normal. Chapter 325. Yili's shadow guard also quickly fought with the West Hill people. With just a few glances, Yili could tell that although these people were wearing West Hill soldiers' uniforms, they were not real soldiers. They were more like Jianghu masters. Yili looked up at Lei Dingfeng, who was also looking at her. She smiled coldly and said, "Kill. As you command." The shadow guard and the soldiers who came with her immediately became excited. They sharpened their swords and charged at the Westhill people. Soon, the two sides were engaged in a fierce battle. It was difficult for two fists to fight against four hands. This principle was once again proven by Qin Feng's specially trained soldiers. When the fighting was coming to an end, Genom of Gojosian was once again a captive of the Dechu state. Looking at Genom of Gojosian, who was brought back, Yili raised her eyebrows in a good mood. Genom of Gojosian's smile was a rare bitterness. The Mahist army is well trained. I admire you. Yili smiled and said, Prince is too polite. The prince is one of the few masters in the world. It is their fortune to be able to receive guidance from the prince. Yili's eyes were filled with satisfaction as she pointed at the soldiers who had just defeated another expert of that era. Although everyone was injured, the soldiers' morale was high. After hearing Yili's words, they raised their heads and puffed out their chests. They saluted Genom of Gojosian and said, Thank you for your guidance, Genom of Gojosian. To be honest, even if Genom of Gojosian only had one arm, he was still more difficult to deal with than Mu Qingcang, who was known as the Dechu state's #1 master. Just by looking at everyone's injuries, it was obvious that if they didn't already have the experience of defeating Mu Qingcang, it would be even more difficult to defeat Genom of Gojosian. This was because Genom of Gojosian respected his status and did not fight to the death with them. Otherwise, it would be hard to avoid casualties. Genom of Gojosian's face twitched slightly. He looked at Yili and asked, What are Princess Ding's plans now? Yili said with a smile, Prince is making things difficult for this consort. Wouldn't it be better for everyone to exchange hostages peacefully and return home? But now, what should I do? On the other side, Lei Tingfeng smiled bitterly and said, Wang Fei, this matter is this lowly prince's fault. Wang Fei, please be magnanimous and let Wang Fei go. Yili said indifferently, Shitzi speaks lightly. If it was the southern Marquis Shitzi or this consort who was injured, what would Shitzi's attitude be right now? Lei Tingfeng knew he was in the wrong. He sighed and said, As long as this lowly prince can do it, Wang Fei, please do not hesitate to ask. Today, he had been too reckless. He thought that Yili would not have made any preparations. He didn't think that Yili's arrangements were waiting for him to make a move. Yili thought for a moment and asked, How about Shitzi lead the army out of Dechu state? Lei Tingfeng's expression darkened slightly. He said, Wang Fei is making things difficult for this lowly prince. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked somewhat helplessly at Genom of Gojosian. She said, Prince, so a mere Xinyang city isn't even worth it. Is Shiling's Genom of Gojosian so cheap? Genom of Gojosian smiled faintly and said, To take Xinyang, Shiling sacrificed countless soldiers. This matter is not something my son can decide. Wang Fei is making things difficult for him. Yili narrowed her eyes slightly and quickly said, All right, this consort will not make things difficult for him. 50,000 dan of grain and 5 million taels of silver. Wang Fei is speaking too carelessly. Lei Tingfeng frowned. Yili snorted coldly and said sternly, Cut off Genom of Gojosian's other hand. Zhuo Jing nodded and said, As you command. Seeing that Zhuo Jing had indeed pulled out his sword from the soldier behind him and was about to swing it at Genom of Gojosian, Lei Tingfeng hurriedly stopped him. Wang Fei, please wait. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at him indifferently. After a while, Lei Tingfeng finally nodded and said, All right, it's a deal. But this lowly prince needs time. Also, Wang Fei must guarantee that father will not be harmed in any way. Otherwise, this lowly prince will slaughter all the people of East Chu wherever the army goes. Yili's smile became even colder. In 5 days, it will still be here. Also, Shitzi Lei had better not be joking. Otherwise, this consort does not mind killing all the generals of Shiling. For example, Xing Bian. Of course, this consort does not mind slaughtering all of Shieling. Leitingfing's heart trembled. He looked deeply at Yili and nodded. It's a deal. When they returned to Jiangxia, Yili waved her hand and had people take Genom of Gojosian and the others away. She took Marquis Nan Shitzi to see Marquis Nan, who had been anxiously waiting. Seeing his son come back covered in injuries, Marquis Nan was pleasantly surprised and distressed. He looked his son up and down and did not forget to ask him where he was injured. Marquis Nan Shitzi probably did not expect that he would have the chance to see his parents again in this life. His eyes reddened. He broke free from Marquis Nan's hand and knelt on the ground. He said in a low voice, "This child has embarrassed father." Marquis Nan pulled him up and said tearfully, "Silly child, it's good that you're back. Why are you still talking about this? It's good that you're back." After the initial joy, Marquis Nan remembered that Yili and the others were still present. He quickly wiped his tears and pulled his son. "It's all thanks to Wang Fei that you can come back safely. Quickly thank Wang Fei for saving your life." Marquis Nan Shitzi stepped forward and bowed. "Many thanks to Wang Fei for saving my life." Yili pursed her lips and smiled. "Brother-in-law, you don't have to be so formal. We're family. Did brother-in-law do anything wrong? Did the people of Shieling hurt you?" Marquis Nan and his son looked at each other. Marquis Nan Shitzi shook his head and smiled. "It's just a small injury. Many thanks, third sister, for your concern. If you need anything in the future, just tell me. The Nan Marquis residents will definitely help you." Yili smiled and thanked him. She knew that even if the Nan Marquis residents could not help the Prince Ding mansion in the future, they would definitely not become the enemy of the Prince Ding mansion. This time, Leitingfing did not play any tricks. 5 days later, at the same time, at the same place, 50,000 dan of rations and 5 million taels of silver were delivered to Yili. Yili also kept her promise and released Genom of Gojosian. Genom of Gojosian returned to Shiling's camp. He turned his head and looked deeply at Yili. "I was too arrogant. Wang Fei has won this round. Princess Ding, we still have a long time ahead of us." Yili smiled sweetly and said, "Prince is joking. How can I dare to say that I have won against Prince? I was just lucky." Genom of Gojosian's expression became slightly subservient. He turned around and left. She was neither arrogant in victory nor discouraged in defeat. Wang Fei, a woman, had easily won a large amount of rations and silver from Shieling. However, she did not show any arrogance on her face. As expected, she was not someone an ordinary woman could compare to. Yili watched as Genom of Gojosian's figure disappeared into the Shieling army. She turned around and said to Feng Zhiyao, "Pass down the order, the entire army is on guard." Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yili said indifferently, "After suffering such a big loss, how can Genom of Gojosian not take revenge? Wang Fei, Xinjiang has been reclaimed by our army." A soldier rushed in with a face full of joy. Yili was stunned. "What did you say?" The soldier raised his head and said loudly, "News just came from the front. Prince led 100,000 troops down from the north and defeated Shiling's northern army. Last night, they reclaimed Xinjiang. Xiuyao is back. Prince is back." Yili and Feng Zhiyao looked at each other and saw the ecstasy in each other's eyes. Yili gathered her thoughts and said loudly, "Return to the city." Chapter 326. Ling Qingyu gritted his teeth and finally said firmly, "I beg Prince to accept me. I am willing to be a pawn as long as I can defeat the Wiling people. After returning to the capital, I am willing to die to atone for my sins." Mo Xiuyao looked at him indifferently and said indifferently after a while, "In that case, I will fulfill your wish. After dismissing everyone, only Feng Xiao and Zhuo Jing were left in the study. Mo Xiaoyao leaned against the couch and looked at the two of them silently, one hand tapping the armrest casually. The study was silent. After a long time, his voice rang out in the study. Feng San, what happened in the capital after I left? Feng Xiao naturally wouldn't hide anything for Mo Jingqi and hurriedly told him everything that had happened after Mo Xiaoyao left the capital, adding fuel to the fire. Although Zhuo Jing always liked to have a cold face in front of others, he spared no effort in speaking ill of people who intended to harm his master. Hearing this, Mo Xiaoyao's originally unpleasant expression became even gloomier. Mo Xiaoyao was really angry. Not only because Mo Jingqi had set his sights on Li Li, but also because he didn't know the severity of the matter as the emperor. In Mo Xiaoyao's opinion, the tens of thousands of soldiers and the lives of all the people in Xinyang were lost because of Mo Jingqi's suspicion and narrow-mindedness. Mo Xiaoyao once wondered if the ancestors of the Ding royal estate were too meddlesome, which caused the emperor to be so wary of the Ding royal estate. Now he truly understood that it wasn't that the ancestors of the Ding royal estate didn't know how to overshadow their master, nor that they didn't know how to avoid the emperor's suspicion. It was that some things had to be done even though they knew they couldn't be done. Good, very good. Mo Xiaoyao laughed softly, but his deep laughter made Feng Xiao shiver for no reason. Mo Xiaoyao looked up and said to the two of them, "You can go back first. This subordinate will take his leave." When Yili stepped into the study, it was already midnight. Although she had just woken up and was a little angry at Mo Xiaoyao's unscrupulous behavior, she couldn't help but walk out of the room to take a look when she realized that he wasn't in the room. Seeing that the light in the study was still on, Yili knew that he must still be working in the study. After thinking about it, she couldn't bear to see him like this. She turned around and went to the kitchen to make some supper and brought it into the study. In the study, Mo Xiaoyao was hunched over his desk, furiously writing. When he heard the sound at the door, he raised his head and saw the woman at the door wearing a plain cloak. Her hair was casually tied up, and she held a tray full of food in her hands as she looked at him quietly. The light shone on her beautiful face, making her inconceivably beautiful and gentle. Mo Xiaoyao's heart warmed. This was his wife. "Li Li, come." Mo Xiaoyao put down his pen and stood up, reaching out his hand to Yili. Yili walked up and placed the tray on the table. She put away the various files on the table and laid out the food as she said, "Is there anything that can't be done tomorrow?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly, pulling Yili to sit on his lap and said, "Li, eat with me." Because he didn't want to disturb Li Li's rest, he only ate a few mouthfuls of dinner, so he was a little hungry now. Yili was a little speechless as she looked at him. How was she going to eat while sitting in his embrace? Mo Xiaoyao pretended not to see her conflicted expression. He scooped up a spoonful of porridge and a refreshing side dish and brought it to Yili's mouth. Yili hesitated for a moment, but seeing that he stubbornly refused to take his hand back, she could only lower her head and eat. Mo Xiaoyao smiled with satisfaction, and then ate 2 more mouthfuls himself. Just like that, the two of them finished the food on the table 1 spoon at a time. When she saw the empty plates on the table, Yili could only twitch her mouth, speechless. After eating supper, Mo Xiaoyao called for the servants to take away the bowls and chopsticks. He didn't let go of Yili, and just kept her in his embrace. The two of them looked at the reports on the table, exchanging opinions from time to time. When Yili saw the statistics of the people who had been massacred in Suncreed City, she lowered her head sadly. "I'm very sorry. This time, it's all my fault." Mo Xiaoyao sighed softly. He lifted her small face and kissed her softly. "Li Li, you've already done very well. You've done even better than I imagined." Mo Xiaoyao was speaking the truth. Even though he had given the command of the Mahist army to Yili, Mo Xiaoyao wasn't too sure how much Yili could control. After all, the heavy responsibility of controlling an army of hundreds of thousands wasn't something that many men could do, even if they were men. But his Lili had really done the best she could. But, if I hadn't ordered people to divert Suncreed City's food and money, perhaps Suncreed City wouldn't have been massacred, Yili said softly. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said lightly, Lili, don't take everything on yourself. You and I both know that you didn't do anything wrong. Even though Xiling is as vast as Dechu State, it's different from Dechu State's fertile land. Xiling has large areas of desert, and the cultivated land isn't even 1/5 that of Dechu State's. In Suncreed City, there's enough food and military supplies to support an army of 500,000 for half a year. Once they get their hands on this batch of food and money, this war will become even more difficult. Also, when Xiling's soldiers invaded Dechu State, they didn't kill the common people not because they didn't want to, but because they were worried that the people would resist. Once this war drags on into winter, has Lili read the history of Xiling's wars? Yili shook her head. In the past, she didn't care about these things. After marrying Mo Xiaoyao, too many things had happened. In reality, she didn't have much time to read books. Mo Xiaoyao said, if Lili has read it, you'll know that once the Xiling army runs out of food, they will quickly attack the common people. In reality, the Xiling army has always thought of themselves as tyrannical. Xiling doesn't produce food, so their food supplies have never been sufficient. To them, the common people of the enemy country are just a backup source of food. Even though Dechu State hasn't been harmed before, the western countries, and even the southern border, have all had their cities massacred by Xiling. If Xiling gets their hands on Suncreed City's food, this war will drag on even longer. Once winter arrives, the food supplies will run out, and more people will be harmed. Besides, even if someone is to be blamed, the first to be blamed is the people who failed to defend the city. Yili leaned into his thick embrace. Even though she knew that Mo Xiaoyao was comforting her, she still felt much more relaxed. Yili wasn't one to dwell on insignificant issues, so she quickly put this matter aside. She lowered her head to look at the shocking numbers on the memorial and sighed. War was always accompanied by the loss of countless common people's innocent lives. This made one feel both heartache and helpless. The two of them huddled under the lamp and talked about various things that happened after they parted. After Mo Xiaoyao heard Genom of Gojoseon's various things, his face immediately darkened. He hugged Yili and said softly, Li is too soft-hearted. Asking him for tens of thousands of dan of food and a few million taels of silver is too cheap for him. If it were I would just break his other hand and be done with it. Yili raised her head and looked amusedly at the strangely childish man in front of her. She said, if that's the case, I'm afraid that we in Xiling will not rest until one of us is dead. Haven't we communicated with the Emperor of Xiling? Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said helplessly, I'm afraid that the Emperor of Xiling won't be of much use. Whether he can live past this year is another matter. Once the Emperor of Xiling dies, I'm afraid there will be another young emperor. The military and political power of Xiling will completely fall into the hands of Genom of Gojoseon. Chapter 327. Yili sighed with some melancholy. If that is really the case, we should have cut off his other hand as well. With that, the two looked at each other and smiled. In the end, a joke was just a joke. In the current situation, if they really fought to the death with the West Hill, it would not benefit them or the Great Chu at all. Mo Xiaoyao held the beautiful person in his arms. His warm gaze fell on the booklet on the table and flashed with a frightening cold light. Genom of Gojoseon, he dared to covet the princess of the Ding Kingdom. Father had been too merciful when he only cut off one of his hands. Mo Xiaoyao's sudden return caused the Xiling army, which had been advancing like a hot knife through butter, to stop in their tracks. But this kind of calm could not last for long. A few days later, the flames of war reignited. Although Xinyang had been retaken, including the north and south armies of Xiling, there were still 5 cities in the northwest of Dechu State. Almost a third of the northwest land had fallen into the hands of the Xiling people. Because Mo Xiuyao had led his army to break through the blockade of the North Army and head straight for Xinyang, although Xinyang had been retaken, the surrounding areas were still occupied by the Xiling people. The entire city of Xinyang was surrounded by enemies on 3 sides. Although the city did not lack for food and military supplies, water was still a huge problem. Even though there were very few people left in the city, there was still a shortage of water for hundreds of thousands of people. It was not that Mo Xiuyao did not know about this problem, but the Dechu state really needed an encouraging piece of news to rouse the monarch and calm the people. Retaking Xinyang was the best choice. After Mo Xiuyao returned, Yili naturally returned the original military affairs to him. She only helped him with some trivial matters and instantly had a lot of free time. While the people that Lin Han had led to follow Mo Xiuyao to the northern tribes and the people that Qin Feng had led to gather information had all returned, Yili remembered something that had been delayed for a long time. She picked Mo Xiuyao and found him when he was free. Originally, there were 63 people who had been trained under Black Cloud Peak. Now, there were only 51 people here. The sacrifice of 12 people was negligible in other armies, but here, it was equivalent to losing almost 1/6 of their fighting power. This subordinate greets His Highness and Her Highness. Mo Xiuyao nodded. Rise. On the trip to the northern tribes, Mo Xiuyao had truly seen the fighting power of the people trained by Yili. At the same time, he became curious about this team. Thank you, Princess. Mo Xiuyao smiled and nodded at Yili. Yili stood up and said, Thank you for your hard work this time. Lin Han, Qin Feng, report the progress of each group. Lin Han stepped forward and said, Princess, of the 8 people who went to the northern tribes this time, 1 died in battle, 1 was seriously injured. The remaining 6 all passed. Qin Feng also stepped forward and said, Princess, 55 people were divided into 11 groups. 1 group failed, 7 died in battle, and 3 were injured. Yili nodded slightly and said, Zhuo Jing will take care of the funeral arrangements for the soldiers who died in battle and the injured. Now, everyone here is the last batch of people who passed this special training. Thank you for your hard work. I have already discussed this with the prince. From today onwards, you will be officially incorporated into the Mahist army and will be personally commanded by the prince and me. Codename Qi Lin. Yili showed a jade pendant in her hand. It was very similar to the Yazi jade pendant that could command the entire Mahist army. However, the carving on it was a lifelike Qi Lin. At the same time, this would be their name from today onwards. From today onwards, they were Qi Lin. Yili smiled and looked at the soldiers in front of her. Although they tried to appear calm, their eyes were still filled with excitement. She said in a low voice, Everyone, what is Qi Lin? Everyone hesitated for a moment before someone answered, Princess, Qi Lin is an auspicious beast. Yili nodded and said, That's right. Qi Lin is an auspicious beast. Qi Lin is not only an auspicious beast, but also a benevolent beast. Qi Lin has horns on its head and meat on its horns. It is a benevolent beast. I also hope that you can become a benevolent beast that protects the common people. When necessary, you can also be a sharp sword that stabs the enemy. Everyone said in unison, We will follow Princess instructions. Mo Xiuyao also said a few words of encouragement. Qin Feng and Lin Han stayed behind before letting everyone leave. When they returned to the study and sat down, Yili looked at Lin Han and asked, How was the trip to the northern tribes? Lin Han replied respectfully, everything went smoothly. Please rest assured, Princess. Yili nodded, looked sideways at Mo Xiaoyao and asked, Princess Ronghua. Mo Xiaoyao said softly, although Princess Ronghua is a little capricious, she is not a fool. Li, don't worry. She won't ruin it. Yili nodded and sighed softly, that's good. Otherwise, this trip will be a big loss. Qin Feng stood aside and listened to the conversation between the two silently. Since the princess and the prince did not avoid him, it meant that they trusted him. He personally participated in the training of the first group of Qi Lin members, so he was very familiar with everyone. He naturally knew who the 8 people that Lin Han brought out were and who came back. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yili with a smile and said, I haven't asked about Princess Li before. This time, on the trip to the northern tribes, I learned that Princess Li is not only in charge of the prince's mansion, but also in the battlefield. She is also very good at training soldiers. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, even Mo Xiaoyao would have found it hard to believe that such an army and soldiers existed in the world. It wasn't that their martial arts were very strong, nor was it that they were good at fighting. It was that they had mastered various skills on the battlefield, and their accuracy was shocking. Mo Xiaoyao even thought that if such an army really appeared, how terrible it would be. Yili glanced at him and said, these training methods use too much manpower and resources, and have high demands on the soldiers themselves. Using them on the battlefield with thousands of soldiers and horses does not have much practical use. It can be said that the losses do not outweigh the gains. No one had been eliminated in this first training. But that was because these people were the best of the best, and many of them had been eliminated during the selection process. More importantly, this was the first time in this era that Yili was training the soldiers she wanted. Because many of the equipment and the fighting methods of the two eras were different, this time could only be considered an exploration. It was hard to say that these people met Yili's requirements. Mo Xiaoyao did not blink and looked with a smile at Yili. Does Princess Li have any suggestions? Yili blinked and looked at Mo Xiaoyao for a long time without saying anything. After a while, she said in a low voice, give me some time to think. Mo Xiaoyao did not care. It was fine as long as he achieved his goal. If Princess Li was not interested in these things, then he would hope that she would just be a leisurely Ding country Wang Fei. But since Princess Li was interested and had the ability, he would not block her light. After dealing with Mo Xiaoyao, Yili turned to say to Qin Feng, starting today, you are the commander of Qi Lin. In the future, these people will be given to you. Qin Feng nodded and said, this subordinate will not betray Wang Fei's trust. Yili looked at him and said, Your Highness, don't speak nonsense. I've never looked down on the Shadow Guards. There were many people in the Shadow Guard with extraordinary abilities. At most, she just felt that it was a waste of talent for the Prince Ding mansion to use people like this. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyebrows and thought for a moment before saying, since Li intends to increase the number of people in Qi Lin, after returning to the capital, let all the Shadow Guard participate in Qi Lin's special training. In the future, the Ding King's palace will cancel the Shadow Guard system. Is this good? Yili was also worried about Mo Xiaoyao's quick decision. Especially when she thought of a certain eccentric Shadow Guard commander. After knowing Mo Xiaoyao's decision, Mo Hua probably had the heart to eat her. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and played with her hair, what's not good about it? Since there's a more advantageous method, why not use it? Yili said, isn't the Shadow Guard specially used to protect the master of the Prince Ding mansion? Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, didn't you also say that Qi Lin's mission also included protection? And this time, they did very well in the northern tribes. It was indeed very good. The people trained by Yili could fight and kill, speak eloquently, act dumb, disguise themselves, use poison, and gather information. Yili was a little speechless as she looked at him. So this was his plan. Prince really knows how to scheme. Yili glanced at him unhappily. In Mo Xiaoyao's eyes, this look was coquettish and flirtatious. His heart moved as he reached out to pull her into his arms and leaned over to kiss her. Their lips and tongues intertwined. Yili was kissed until she almost couldn't breathe. Mo Xiaoyao's large palms made her beautiful face turn red and her body go limp. Ever since he returned from the northern tribes, Mo Xiaoyao had obviously changed a lot compared to the past. These changes made Yili happy, but occasionally, she couldn't bear it. Oh. Bastard Mo Xiaoyao, will you die if you don't go into heat? Mo Xiaoyao chuckled. His cool lips moved around her slender neck and his warm breath made Yili's face turn even redder. Bastard Mo Xiaoyao. Yili's clear eyes narrowed. She raised her hand and wanted to hit him. Mo Xiaoyao seemed to have expected this move. He raised his hand and gently caressed it. Yili, don't you feel hurt if you hit me? Yili rolled her eyes. She raised her head and touched Mo Xiaoyao's forehead. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her and raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yili calmly said, "You don't have a fever. You're dreaming in the middle of the day." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned when he heard this. He leaned on Yili's shoulder and laughed. After a while, he raised his head and said gently, "Yili is so cruel. Even if Yili doesn't care about me, your husband will worry about Yili's hand hurting." Yili was powerless. She was not used to Mo Xiaoyao's sudden mushy behavior. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao would occasionally joke with her, calling her wife as her husband. But after coming back this time, Mo Xiaoyao had obviously become more fond of sticking to her side. Sitting in Mo Xiaoyao's arms, Yili softly asked, "Xiaoyao, what's wrong?" Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. He smiled and said, "What do you mean what's wrong? Does Yili hate your husband?" Yili calmly looked at him. The smile on Mo Xiaoyao's face gradually faded. He once again pulled her into his arms and took a deep breath before saying, "Yili, I'm a little scared." Yili's heart trembled. Although Mo Xiaoyao had always been gentle and refined, but Yili knew very well what a proud man he was. If it wasn't because he could not take it, he would not show his weakness in front of anyone. No, even if it was because he could not take it, he would not show it in front of others. "What's wrong?" "When I heard about the bloody battle at the Ding Palace in the northern tribes, when I knew that you had to deal with Mo Jingqi and those greedy nobles, and that you had to lead the army to battle, I regretted. He regretted agreeing to go to the northern tribes with Mo Jingqi. He had insisted on not going, and Mo Jingqi had not dared to force him. He even regretted that he had not killed those people earlier. Every time he thought about the possibility of losing her, the fear and killing intent in his heart made him want to destroy everything in sight. Yili, luckily you're fine." Yili had never thought of herself as a soft-hearted person, but right now, her heart was as soft as a ball of cotton. This strong and powerful man had become so weak and afraid because of her. Yili had never been clearer about this than now. Gently wrapping her arms around his shoulders, Yili's voice was soft but firm. "No, as long as I'm alive, I will always be by your side." Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers. "Really?" Yili said, "As long as you don't leave, I will not abandon you." This was the most sincere vow she could make. Yili already knew that Mo Xiaoyao had done enough for her. She also knew that she could not bear for this man to suffer. Chapter 329. Never leave or abandon. Mo Xiaoyao murmured softly. He liked this phrase. The thought of never leavingly made him happy from the bottom of his heart. Anyone who dared to stand in their way, he would make them pay the price. Shilling Camp. The atmosphere in the tent was gloomy and chilly. Genom of Gojosian's expression was the ugliest it had ever been since Shilling sent out its troops. Ever since Mo Xiaoyao suddenly appeared to see Xinyang, the entire army of Dechu State seemed to have suddenly come alive. In the short span of 10 days, the results of nearly a month's worth of battles seemed to have disappeared. Not only had the northern army been defeated by Mo Xiaoyao's surprise attack, the southern army had also met with setbacks. Only the south vanquishing king personally oversaw the central army, which was relatively stable. But how difficult would it be to take back Suncreed City from Mo Xiaoyao's hands again? Why did they have to lose 50,000 dan of rations and millions of taels of silver to Princess Ding? This made the Shilling army, which was already lacking in rations, even worse in the coming winter. "Prince, please calm down," the general said with some trepidation. Genom of Gojosian snorted coldly and said, calm down, calm down. Do you not know how to say anything other than calm down? Knowing that the prince was in a fit of anger, the generals did not dare to speak. They could only look at Lei Tingfeng, who was sitting to the side, pleading for help. Lei Tingfeng smiled faintly. He stood up and said to Genom of Gojosian, "Father, we all know that Mo Xiaoyao is not easy to deal with. Father, please don't make things difficult for them. They have already done their best." Genom of Gojosian snorted softly. He swept a cold glance over everyone and said, "Go back. If you are flustered by the Mahist army again tomorrow, you may as well take off your armor and become pawns." Everyone agreed and looked gratefully at Lei Tingfeng before leaving the tent dejectedly. Only Genom of Gojosian and his son were left in the tent. There were no outsiders. Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, "Father, we cannot rush to deal with Mo Xiaoyao. Even though we have suffered some losses these few days, we are not at a disadvantage in the current situation." Genom of Gojosian sighed softly and said, "I do not know this. But Tingfeng, do not underestimate Mo Xiaoyao. In I's opinion, Mo Xiaoyao is even more dangerous than Mo Lufang." Lei Tingfeng raised his eyebrows in surprise. He did not think that his father would have such a high opinion of Mo Xiaoyao, whom he had only met a few times. Mo Lufang was Mo Xiaoyao's father. His father's greatest enemy in this life could also be said to be his only enemy. As expected, the student has surpassed the master. If Mo Xiaoyao had been living peacefully these few years, I might not have valued him so much. But you also know what kind of life he has been living these few years, and what kind of injuries he suffered back then. But look at the performance of the Mahist army these few days. Mo Xiaoyao is not unfamiliar at all. He is even more experienced than the legends say. This means that even if Mo Xiaoyao was sick and did not leave the Ding King's residence, he still has the ability to completely control the Mahist army. Furthermore, the Mahist army is still wholeheartedly convinced by him. This. Tingfeng, are you able to do it? Genom of Gojosian lightly asked. Lei Tingfeng slightly frowned and thought for a moment. Then he raised his head and his expression was somewhat serious. His smile carried some shame and unwillingness, but he still shook his head and said, "Your son is useless. I cannot do it." No one knew better than him how badly Mo Xiaoyao had been injured back then. He knew that under that kind of situation, he would definitely not be able to control the Mahist army as perfectly as Mo Xiaoyao. It was even possible that he would have been defeated by that kind of pain and torture, or become crazy from being swallowed by hatred. Genom of Gojosian nodded and said with some relief, "It is a good thing to be able to clearly see your own shortcomings. Mo Lufang gave birth to a good son, and also a good wife. He really has a good life." Lei Tingfeng thought about the day of the exchange of hostages, the woman in white who was talking and laughing calmly. He could not help but admit that Mo Xiaoyao was indeed very lucky. Marrying such a woman as his wife, how many heroes in the world would envy Emo Xiuyao to death? What plans does father have? Lei Tingfeng asked. Genom of Gojosian raised his eyebrows and said, "What plans do you think father has?" Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, "Although father looked very angry on the surface, he was not truly angry. This means that father already has a plan in his heart. If father was truly angry, not to mention him pleading for leniency, even if the Heavenly Emperor came, it would be useless." Genom of Gojosian casually played with the jade thumb ring on his hand and said with a cold smile, "That year, Emo Xiuyao was lucky and the Ding royal estate was not destined to be destroyed. This time, I want to see if he is still so lucky." Lei Tingfeng's heart moved and his expression changed slightly. "Father, you plan to..." Genom of Gojosian leisurely smiled and said, "The Ding royal estate is not only an eyesore to I, Prince is right. The Ding royal estate is indeed an eyesore to many people. In this world, there are many people who want it to disappear." A gentle voice came from outside the tent. Lei Tingfeng frowned when he heard this and a trace of disgust flashed across his face. Genom of Gojosian saw this and shook his head in amusement. The curtain of the large tent was lifted from the outside and a slender and graceful figure walked in. Passing through the screen of the tiger-roaring forest, the woman who appeared in the large tent was wearing a pink palace dress. Her eyebrows were dark and her lips were red without makeup. Her appearance was so exquisite that there was not a single flaw to be found. Her sparkling eyes moved and brought along a little starlight that made people intoxicated. Even though Lei Tingfeng seemed to hate her, when she looked over, he could not help but be dazed for a moment. Seeing Lei Tingfeng being dazed, the woman's lips curled into a smile. She slowly walked forward and bowed, "Greetings to Prince, heir." Genom of Gojosian looked at her indifferently and asked, "Why are you here? Doesn't the emperor need someone?" The woman rolled her eyes and said with a smile, "Prince, you must be joking. The emperor is now seriously ill in bed. The empress is enough. Why would he need me to serve him? Don't tell me. Prince doesn't want to see me." Genom of Gojosian said with a smile, "How can that be? You've come at the right time. I need your help." The woman's smile became even more joyful. With her smile, the originally solemn tent suddenly seemed to become a little more colorful. "Prince, Long Her will do her best to fulfill the prince's orders." This woman was by Long, imperial concubine Qingrong of West Hill. She was also the first beauty of Dechu State, Su Zuidi. Lei Tingfeng's absent-mindedness only lasted for a moment. As soon as Genom of Gojosian spoke, he had already regained his senses. He just listened to the conversation between the two in silence. His eyes were still full of disgust and disdain when he glanced at Su Zuidi, as if he was looking at something dirty. However, there seemed to be something deeper struggling in the depths of his eyes. Genom of Gojosian had been paying attention to his son's expression since the beginning of the conversation. Seeing him like this, he sighed slightly in his heart. Tingfeng was indeed the most outstanding child among all his children, even among the emperor of Shiling's clan. Unfortunately, he was still a little lacking compared to Emo Xiuyao. "What orders does Prince have?" Su Zuidi said with a smile. "That Yili, other than having a good family background, what else does she have?" "No, she doesn't even have a good family background, she just has a good grandfather. It's a pity that Master Qingyun hasn't paid attention to worldly affairs for many years. She is Prince Ding's legitimate fiancée, Dechu states, #1 beauty in the world. Could it be that she can't compare to a woman with no talent and no looks?" Lei Tingfeng snorted disdainfully, clearly expressing his meaning. Su Zuidi glared angrily at him. Genom of Gojosian smiled and said, "How could that be? I absolutely believe that Long Her is a peerless beauty in the world. How could Mo Xiaoyao not be defeated and fall under Long Er's skirt? Su Zuidi smiled at Leitingfing with a bit of pride. What does the prince want me to do? Genom of Gojoseon smiled and didn't say anything. Father, will Mo Xiaoyao take the bait? After Su Zuidi left the tent, Leitingfing frowned and asked. Genom of Gojoseon looked at him and asked, do you think I will be infatuated with her? Leitingfing shook his head. He naturally saw clearly that although his father had some connection with Su Zuidi, he definitely didn't have any true feelings for her. Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, since I won't take the bait, then why would Mo Xiaoyao? Then father, isn't it too childish to let her seduce Mo Xiaoyao? If that woman had the ability to seduce Mo Xiaoyao, why would she appear in the Western Tomb? Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, who said that I want her to seduce Mo Xiaoyao? With such a wonderful person like the princess consort of Dinghua, Bailong is just a pretty but useless vase. Leitingfing frowned, but quickly relaxed and looked up at Genom of Gojoseon and said, father has other plans. I just want her to distract Mo Xiaoyao's attention for I. If she can't even do this well, then she's useless. Genom of Gojoseon smiled coldly, his voice cold and emotionless. There was no trace of the gentleness and love from before. In Xinyang City, Yili sat leisurely beside Mo Xiaoyao, looking at a secret letter she had just received and raised her eyebrows with interest. Mo Xiaoyao looked up and happened to see her interested expression. He couldn't help but ask curiously, is there any interesting news? Yili passed the secret letter to him and said, there's a nobleman from the Emperor of Shiling's palace. I'm afraid that he has already arrived at the West Hill barracks in 2 days. Mo Xiaoyao frowned slightly. A nobleman from the palace. In the West Hill palace, other than the Emperor of Shiling, the only noblemen who could be called noblemen were the concubines and princesses. After thinking for a moment, Mo Xiaoyao asked, Bailong. Prince is wise. Yili was not stingy with her praise. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and read the letter in his hand. He looked up at Yili and said, I didn't know that Mr. Li had such a talent in the West Hill. It's not easy to find out news about the West Hill now. Ever since Han Mingyue went to the West Hill, the Prince Ding mansion could clearly feel that the Shadow Guard's actions in the West Hill were restricted everywhere. After all, Han Mingyue specialized in intelligence and had a good understanding of the Prince Ding mansion. Is an heir in the West Hill now? Yili nodded and said, among Zhuo Jing and the others, an heir is the most suitable for intelligence. Su Zui, the news of Bailong coming to the Dechu state was extremely secretive. He could find out in time, which means that the intelligence network in the West Hill has already achieved some success. But Yili couldn't help but frown when she thought of something. Her original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill was not to establish an intelligence network in the West Hill, but for the Biluo flower and the flaming lotus. Unfortunately, there was no news of the Biluo flower until now. As for the flaming lotus, she had to wait until June or July next year. Mo Xiaoyao only needed to think for a moment to understand Yili's original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill. He patted the back of Yili's hand comfortingly and said softly, don't worry, I'll be fine. Yili smiled and nodded. It was useless to worry about a problem that couldn't be solved in a short time. Yili's lips curled into a strange smile. Prince, do you think we'll be able to see the elegance of the first beauty this time? Mo Xiaoyao smiled somewhat helplessly. He raised his eyebrows and asked, so what if we see it? So what if we don't see it? Yili smiled and said, won't Prince have tender feelings for the fairer sex? Mo Xiaoyao looked at her with a smile, his eyes filled with endless tenderness and love. In your husband's eyes, in this world, only my wife is a fragrant and beautiful jade. Yili couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth, throwing the free sweet words to the side. Because they had received the news earlier, when they finally met, they naturally wouldn't be as excited, happy, or angry as some people had imagined. Yili and Mo Xiaoyao sat calmly in the flower pavilion, looking at the beautiful woman who had just been brought in. It had to be said that there was still a certain difference between the portrait and the real person. Even though Yili felt that the original portrait was beautiful enough, the woman in front of her was even more charming and moving than the beautiful woman in the portrait. Curling the corner of her lips slightly, Yili turned her head to look at Mo Xiaoyao sitting next to her. As if their hearts were connected, Mo Xiaoyao also turned his head to give her a faint smile. Yili twitched the corner of her mouth and turned her head. Chapter 331. In the hall, Su Zuidi looked at the two arrogant people on the seats, feeling very angry. Meeting with Mo Xiaoyao again, she had imagined many scenarios. It could be joy, or it could be anger and ridicule, but she never thought that Mo Xiaoyao would turn a blind eye to her. For a stunning beauty, this was definitely a great humiliation. Xiaoyao. Suppressing the anger in her heart, Su Zuidi called out softly. Her limpid eyes were filled with tears as she looked at the two people pitifully. There was also a hint of hidden bitterness in her eyes, as if tears would fall at any time. Even Yili couldn't help but praise her good acting skills in her heart. But this Su Zuidi was someone who had known Mo Xiaoyao since he was young. Could it be that she didn't know anything about the Ding Prince's residence? She actually thought that this kind of meeting would cause some kind of impact on Mo Xiaoyao. As a result, this kind of situation appeared. A rare beauty in the world stood in front of the hall in grief, as if looking at a heartless man, and looked at the Ding Prince who was calmly drinking tea in the hall. In addition, Yili was sitting on the side watching the play. If an outsider came in, they would mistakenly think that this was a play where a heartless man was fooling around with a beauty outside and abandoned her. Thinking of this, Yili couldn't help but laugh. Mo Xiaoyao and Su Zuidi turned to look at her at the same time. Yili coughed lightly and sat up straight, trying to make herself appear warm and hospitable. This Imperial concubine Bai, you are a guest from afar, please sit. The words Imperial concubine Bai made Su Zuidi's expression slightly change. She withdrew the gaze that was originally directed at Mo Xiaoyao and looked at Yili, softly saying, "Is this the Ding Prince's concubine?" Yili couldn't help but rub the goosebumps on her arms. What did this gaze mean, as if she had let her down? Without waiting for Yili to speak, Su Zuidi had already stepped forward and bowed slightly to Yili. Princess concubine has worked hard to take care of Xiaoyao, Zuidi thanks you. This time, Yili finally couldn't remain calm. She thought that this Su Zuidi was a devastatingly beautiful woman. Although she believed in Mo Xiaoyao's feelings for her from the bottom of her heart, she was still more or less a little worried. But what's going on now? This Su Zuidi actually has a problem in her brain. Since Zuidi, Princess Su Zuidi, why would she, as an outsider, thank her for taking care of her? She glanced at Mo Xiaoyao unhappily. What's with your ex-fiancé? Is there something wrong with her brain? Mo Xiaoyao smiled at her indifferently. How would this prince know? We haven't seen each other for many years. You weren't like this in the past. Really, Lord Father's taste isn't that bad. Lightly coughing, Yili lowered her head and took a sip of tea. Only then did she adjust the expression on her face and gently smile at Su Zuidi. Imperial concubine Bai's words are too serious. This concubine and the prince are husband and wife, taking care of him is this concubine's duty. What's more, this concubine is young and doesn't know any better. Usually, it's the prince who takes care of this concubine more. There's no need to thank Imperial concubine Bai, right? The smile on Su Zuidi's face froze. She raised her head and saw Yili's expression that wasn't a smile. She suddenly remembered Genom of Gojoseon's warning, the Ding Prince's concubine isn't an easy person to deal with. If you look down on her, you'll only bring yourself big trouble. The Princess Ding in front of her was inferior to her in terms of appearance, temperament, and talent, but she was able to receive such praise from Genom of Gojosian. This caused Su Zuidi to instinctively feel a sense of dissatisfaction and hostility. So from the beginning, she deliberately ignored Yili. When she realized that Imo Xiuyao wouldn't pay attention to her, she turned her attention to Yili. However, a mere exchange of 2 sentences had rendered her speechless. Xiuyao, how have you been these years? Realizing that the Ding prince's concubine wasn't as easy to deal with as she thought, Su Zuidi turned her gaze back to Imo Xiuyao. Imo Xiuyao slightly frowned and calmly drank his tea. Not bad. Why are you here? Su Zuidi gently bit her cherry lips, her watery eyes slightly red as she looked at him with grievance. Do you still hate me? I know you blame me. There were many times when I wanted to come back to see you and beg for your forgiveness. But I didn't dare. Sob. Before she finished speaking, pearl-like tears had already fallen. What a beautiful scene of weeping pear blossoms, it made one's heart sway uncontrollably. Unfortunately, the 2 people present weren't ordinary people. Yili resisted the itch in her throat and said, Imperial concubine Bai, our prince wants to ask you, why are you here? I snuck out. Su Zuidi quickly glanced at Imo Xiuyao, a trace of red appearing on her beautiful face. I know that Xiling and the Dechu state are at war, and I also know that you, Xiuyao, will definitely appear here. No matter what. I'm still a citizen of the Dechu state, I can't go back. If I'm caught, the Emperor and Genom of Gojosian will definitely not let me go. Xiuyao, I beg you, don't drive me away. Yili silently looked at the sky. She understood, this Su Zuidi wanted to play them like fools. Yili faintly raised her eyebrows. Since Su Zuidi liked to play, there was no harm in playing with her. Imperial concubine Bai, is young Master Mingyu in Xiling? Su Zuidi glanced at her, originally not wanting to answer. But she saw that Imo Xiuyao was also looking at her at the same time, so she could only say softly, I haven't seen young Master Han in a long time. Yili said, speaking of which. Han Mingyue betrayed the country and defected to the enemy, his crime deserves death. But this person is too cunning, this imperial concubine, and the prince can't find him for a while. I wonder if imperial concubine Bai can ask him to make a trip back to the Dechu state. Su Zuidi looked at Yili with some displeasure and frowned. I don't know where he is, I haven't seen him in a long time. Really, Xiuyao, I won't lie to you. Imo Xiuyao had no reaction to this. Yili said with a smile, it doesn't matter if you don't know, as long as Imperial concubine Bai is here, there's no need to worry that young Master Mingyu won't come. Prince, don't you think so? Imo Xiuyao nodded, what Li said is very true. I just so happen to have a debt to settle with Han Mingyue. Imperial concubine Bai will be handed over to Li. Hearing this, Su Zuidi was clearly deeply hurt. She clutched her chest and looked at Imo Xiuyao in grief. Xiuyao, you really still hate me. You want to use me to catch young Master Han. Yili leisurely admired her slender fingers, while smiling at Su Zuidi. Didn't Imperial concubine Bai come here to beg our prince's forgiveness? Su Zuidi hesitated for a moment, but still nodded. Yili cheerfully clapped her hands and said, that's great, as long as Imperial concubine Bai helps us catch young Master Mingyu, our prince will definitely believe in Imperial concubine Bai's sincerity. Prince, don't you think so? Imo Xiuyao looked at Yili with a gentle gaze, softly saying, Li is right. Obviously, such a gentle Imo Xiuyao made the hangover even harder to accept. Su Zuidi stared blankly at the 2 people in front of her, momentarily speechless. Yili didn't give her a chance to refuse, and said with a smile, so Imperial Concubine Bai has agreed, that's great. Since that's the case, Imperial Concubine Bai can stay here with peace of mind. As long as you live in Suncrete City, this concubine guarantees that no matter if it's the Emperor Shiling or Genom King Gojosian, not a single person will be able to touch Imperial Concubine Bai. Of course, it was even more impossible to pass on any information. She shook her lips and looked at Mo Xiaoyao with grief in her voice. You don't want to see me? Mo Xiaoyao's expression did not change. His gaze was sharp as he stared at her and said in a low voice, I ask you, what are you doing here? Su Zuidi was startled. She gave a bitter laugh and looked at him with grief, saying, I know, you still hate me. You still blame me for leaving you behind that year, right? But I was also forced to do so. Why can't you forgive me? You're still guarding against me like I'm an enemy. Can't I even come out to take a breather? If you hate me so much, why don't you just kill me? Mo Xiaoyao frowned, no longer paying attention to Su Zuidi. He said to the empty street, Men. Two figures quickly appeared at the corner of the street, respectfully waiting for orders. Mo Xiaoyao pointed at Su Zuidi, who was covering her face and crying, and said coldly, Take her back. If I see her come out again, you can go receive your punishment yourselves. This subordinate obeys. The two said in unison. Su Zuidi looked at Mo Xiaoyao in shock and said with a face full of disbelief, You want to put me under house arrest? Xiaoyao, you're so ruthless. My grandfather will not allow you to treat me like this. Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently, You want to let Elder Su know that you're still alive? Su Zuidi was suddenly speechless. With her grandfather's temper, if he knew what she had done all these years, he would definitely kill her. She glanced at Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li who were still holding hands. Although Su Zuidi was unwilling, she couldn't follow the shadow guard back. If she was forcefully escorted back, it would be even more humiliating. Yi Li smiled at the resentful look Su Zuidi gave her before she left, and shrugged indifferently. No matter how beautiful a person is, you'll get used to it after seeing it too much. She had always thought that a true beauty should be just beautiful. Being too beautiful. Sometimes, it's also a flaw. She accompanied Mo Xiaoyao to walk around the city to check on the various defenses. After comforting the lucky survivors in the city, the two returned to the governor's residence. As soon as they entered, Mo Xiaoyao was asked to leave by Feng Zhiyao. Yi Li also returned to the study to deal with the matters she needed to deal with. Chapter 333. Zhuojing and Lin Han had already put all kinds of information files and booklets on the desk. Seeing Yi Li come in, Lin Han and Zhuojing, who were still busy, quickly got up and bowed. Yi Li waved her hand to indicate that they didn't need to bow. The two of them then sat down and focused on the files in their hands. After 2 months of teaching, Zhuojing and Lin Han could basically meet Yi Li's requirements for the position of assistant. This was especially true for Zhuojing. As he had spent more time by Yi Li's side than Lin Han, he could understand Yi Li's intentions better. Most of the time, Zhuojing did not need to speak. Just by raising his hand, he could understand what she wanted. This freed Yi Li from her busy work every day. She only needed to pay attention to some of the more important matters that required her to make decisions. Is there any news from an heir? Yi Li sat down and asked as she picked up the booklets in her hands that needed to be dealt with. Lin Han got up and presented a booklet, saying, This was received as soon as possible. An heir had someone send it back quickly. Yi Li took it and opened it. The booklet was densely filled with words. The contents were all related to Su Zuidi. It included Su Zuidi's current status in the West Hill, as well as the situation of the Westhill family behind her. There were also many things about Su Suodi in the palace, as well as her relationship with the Emperor of Xiling and the concubines and princesses in the palace. Yili was amazed when she saw the back. She didn't expect that Su Suodi was not only the Emperor of Xiling's favorite concubine, but also said that she had a very ambiguous relationship with Genom of Gojoseon. Su Suodi's relationship with the Emperor of Xiling's family was very bad. She had almost been killed by the White Queen several times. It was all thanks to Genom of Gojoseon that the danger was averted. After that, Genom of Gojoseon directly suppressed the White Empress. Now, the White Empress was more like a puppet in the Xiling Palace. In the palace of the Emperor of Xiling, Su Suodi had the final say. Yili was a little puzzled. Why would Su Suodi, who could be said to have absolute power in the harem, come all the way back to the Dachu state? Wasn't she afraid that Imo Shioya would still hold a grudge against her for what happened all those years ago? Or was it because she was too confident in her looks that Imo Shioya would fall at her feet? After reading Su Suodi's life story, which was more like an unofficial legend, Yili pursed her lips in boredom and said, "I'll send it to Prince when I have time later." Lin Han nodded. He put the booklet aside and prepared to send it to Prince after he was done with his work. Suodi requests to see third Miss Yi. Su Suodi's soft voice came from outside the door. Yili frowned and thought for a while before saying, "Concubine Bai, please come in." Outside the door, Su Suodi glanced angrily at the two guards at the door. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Can I go in now?" Unfortunately, the beauty's angry and charming appearance was like a stone puppet in the eyes of the two loyal guards. They said respectfully, "The princess invites concubine Bai in." Being addressed as noble consort Bai made her feel both angry and embarrassed. Everyone in the Mahist army knew that she was Imo Shioyao's fiancée, but the people around Imo Shioyao and Yili all called her concubine Bai. She couldn't help but wonder if they were deliberately mocking her. In fact, Su Suodi thought too much. Most people in the Mahist army knew that Prince's former fiancée was the #1 beauty in the world, Su Suodi, but they also knew that Su Suodi was already dead. Even if she called herself Su Suodi, as long as Prince didn't admit it, it wasn't true in the eyes of these people. Moreover, both the prince and the princess called her concubine Bai, so the subordinates naturally had to follow suit. With a soft snort, Su Suodi stepped into the study. As soon as she entered the study, she saw Yili sitting behind the desk and looking at the booklet in her hand. Not far from the other side of the study, 2 tables were put together and were also piled with all kinds of books, booklets, and files. Lin Han and Zhua Jing sat at the table, busy with the things in their hands. They didn't even look at the #1 beauty. It wasn't that they didn't like to look at the beauty, but this beauty kept bumping into Prince from time to time these days. Coincidentally, the prince was with the princess most of the time, and they were also with the princess most of the time. So it was inevitable that they saw the beauty more often. The world liked beauties because they were unattainable. If this beauty kept sticking to you and pestering you, no matter how beautiful the beauty was, it was inevitable that she would lose some of her luster. Looking at Yili's busy appearance, Su Suodi's unwillingness grew even more. When she was still by Imo Shioyao's side, not to mention helping with the affairs, Imo Shioyao didn't even allow her to enter the study. But now, Yili was sitting in Imo Shioyao's seat and handling the affairs of the Ding King's residence. The thing that she didn't get before was obtained by someone who was inferior to her. How could Su Suodi be reconciled with such a gap? Miss Yi. Su Suodi looked at the young woman who was still busy with her own affairs in an orderly manner and frowned unhappily. "Don't you know how to treat guests at all?" Yili raised her head and glanced at her, softly saying, "There are many Miss Yi in this world, but there is only one Princess Ding. If Imperial Concubine Bai knows how to treat guests, this consort will naturally know how to treat guests. Imperial Concubine Bai, please take a seat and serve tea." Su Zuidi bit her cherry lips and confirmed that Yili really didn't put her in her eyes at all. She snorted softly and turned to sit down at the side. Not long after, someone brought tea and placed it in front of Su Zuidi before silently taking his leave. Yili wrote the last word on the booklet in her hand before putting down the brush and looking up at Su Zuidi. "Imperial concubine Bai, do you have something to discuss with this consort?" Su Zuidi looked at Zhuo Jing and Lin Han, who were sitting at the side, and said, "Zuidi has something to discuss with the princess in private." Yili pursed her lips and smiled. "There's no need to be like this. The two of them are not only this consort's right-hand men, they are also loyal to the Ding Palace and the prince. No matter what Imperial concubine Bai wants to say, there's no need to avoid them." Su Zuidi was very angry at Yili's stubbornness, but there was nothing she could do. Because Yili was obviously not interested in what she wanted to say. Helpless, Su Zuidi could only stare at Yili and say, "Does the princess not want to know my identity?" Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled slightly at Lin Han. "Lin Han, let Imperial concubine Bai see the booklet just now." Lin Han responded and got up to deliver the booklet to Su Zuidi. Su Zuidi looked at Yili strangely before flipping open the booklet in her hand. The more she read, the paler her face became. The booklet clearly investigated everything she had done in Xiling all these years. After all, even if Su Zuidi changed her name in Xiling, it was not considered too conspicuous. But in the end, she was still the emperor of Xiling's most beloved concubine. How could she completely disappear in front of everyone's eyes? As long as they knew that Bai Long was Su Zuidi, it would be easy to investigate her background. Su Zuidi put down the booklet in her hand somewhat dispiritedly. She glanced at Yili, who had a calm expression and felt even more embarrassed in her heart. "These. Xiao Yao knows all these," Yili said. "I was just about to send it to him in a while." "I won't allow you to show it to him," Su Zuidi screamed. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han, who were at the side, frowned at the same time. Looking at the stunning beauty who had finally lost her composure, their eyes were even more disapproving. Their princess consort had never lost her composure and acted so disrespectfully. Chapter 334. Yili picked up the tea on the table and took a sip. The slightly bitter herbal tea made her frown slightly. She raised her eyes and asked in confusion, "Why? Why? Why?" "In short, I won't allow you to show it to him," Su Zuidi said firmly. Yili said indifferently, "Imperial concubine Bai has misunderstood. What this concubine is saying is, why does Imperial concubine Bai think that this concubine will listen to you? You." Su Zuidi's face turned green and white. After a while, she finally calmed down. She sat down again and even elegantly raised her hand to brush the white clothes on her body. She smiled sweetly at Yili and said, "I know that the princess is jealous of me, right?" "That's right. After all, I grew up with Xiaoyao. Even if I was immature and left him in the past, now that I'm back, Xiaoyao will forgive me sooner or later." "Are you scared?" Yili silently glanced at Su Zuidi, then lowered her head and continued to look at the booklet on the table. Su Zuidi covered her mouth and chuckled, saying, "Xiaoyao and I grew up together since we were young. He has never been willing to let me tire myself out to do anything. Seeing that you've worked so hard, when I reconcile with Xiaoyao in the future, I will leave you a place to stay." Yili rubbed the space between her eyebrows and looked at the woman in front of her who was happily directing and acting. She curled her lips and said, "Go and invite the prince over. Tell him that Imperial concubine Bai is suffering from hysteria." Zhuo Jing's expression twisted, then he quickly got up and dashed off. Mo Xiaoyao arrived very quickly. When he came in, Su Zuidi was staring at Yili in a daze. Su Zuidi now somewhat believed Genom of Gojoseon's words. Yili was definitely the most difficult woman to deal with in her life. Whether it was imperial concubine Lu who was almost on par with her in the Chu capital, or the former empress who almost killed her in the emperor of Shiling's palace, or even the current empress, they were all completely different from Yili. Su Zuidi boasted that she had seen many people in her life, but she had never seen a woman like Yili. Whether it was sowing discord or angering her, it was completely useless against her. It was as if she could not be angry or jealous at all. Facing her, Su Zuidi even felt like a clown. Xiuyao. Seeing Mo Xiuyao enter, Su Zuidi blinked and went up to greet him. Mo Xiuyao stood at the door. His gaze swept over her and quickly landed on Yili, who was still sitting behind the desk. He asked softly, "Lili, what's wrong?" Yili casually used her chin to point at Su Zuidi who was standing at the side and looking at Mo Xiuyao pitifully. Mo Xiuyao walked to Yili's side and sat down. "Lili, do as you see fit. I am in the middle of a discussion with General Lu and the others." Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled, saying, "I don't dare." Imperial concubine Bai and the prince grew up together. No matter what, there is still some friendship between them. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows, saying, "I was the second son of the Ding king when I was young. How could I grow up together with the young miss of the Bai family of West Hill?" Yili narrowed her eyes at him, then Imperial concubine Bai. "Isn't Imperial concubine Bai a captive that we caught? Speaking of which, letting a captive run around the residence is your dereliction of duty," Lili Mo Xiuyao said with a smile. "Xiuyao, you treat me as a captive." Su Zuidi's body trembled, and she asked with a miserable expression. Mo Xiuyao said lightly, "You are the imperial concubine of West Hill, not a captive. Could it be that I colluded with the enemy, betrayed the country, and hid in the enemy's royal family? You are so cruel." Su Zuidi looked at the two people sitting side by side in front of her with a resentful expression, tears falling like rain. Mo Xiuyao sneered and said indifferently, "Put away your appearance. It is a waste to use it on I thought that Han Mingyue had told you what I said. Or, you thought that I was joking?" Su Zuidi trembled. That's right, Han Mingyue had said it. But she was too confident in her appearance, and always thought that it was because Mo Xiuyao had not seen her for too long. As long as Mo Xiuyao saw her in person, he would definitely forgive her. Mo Xiuyao said with a smile, "It's good that you showed up yourself. I was worried that there was no place to find Han Mingyue. Stay in the mansion obediently for the next few days. When Han Mingyue arrives, I will deal with you together." Su Zuidi was stunned for a moment, and then asked, "In your eyes, am I not as important as Han Mingyue? Do you hate me so much that you won't forgive me no matter what?" Mo Xiuyao said, "Han Mingyue is the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and her spies are all over the world. What are you?" This time, Su Zuidi really believed that Mo Xiuyao did not care about her. Han Mingyue was the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and whether as a friend or an enemy, she was someone that Mo Xiuyao would not ignore. But what was she? The most beautiful woman in the world. If Mo Xiuyao could really be captivated by her beauty, how could she be so cruel as to leave him in the first place? "I love you," Su Zuidi murmured softly. No matter how many men she had, even she herself could not deny that the only one she could truly love was the man in front of her. Mo Xiuyao glanced regretfully at Yili, who was sitting beside him with her chin propped up and watching the show. Yili had never said that she loved him. If these words were said by Yili. Just thinking about it, Mo Xiuyao felt that his heart was filled with happiness and joy. The joy in his heart seemed to be about to burst out of his chest. Xiuyao. Seeing that Mo Xiuyao was lost in thought, Su Zuidi thought that he was wavering, and happily stepped forward to pull him. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and did not even look at Su Zuoti's hand, saying, "Since Yili said that you have hysteria, go see a doctor. Shuo Jing, invite the doctor to Imperial Concubine Bai's courtyard later." Shuo Jing stood up and replied, "This subordinate obeys. Imperial Concubine Bai, please." Su Zuoti gritted her teeth and waved Shuo Jing's hand away. She turned to glare at Mo Xiaoyao and said bitterly, "I know, you will never forgive me, will you? Since that is the case, I might as well just die like this." After saying that, she turned around and slammed her head against the pillar next to her. Shuo Jing was standing just a step away from her, and he could have grabbed her with a raise of his hand. But she did not know what Shuo Jing was thinking, and he put his hand back down before he could touch Su Zuoti's clothes. Thus, with a bang, a bloody mark was left on the pillar. Su Zuoti's body went limp and slowly slid to the ground, the blood on her forehead flowing down her cheeks. Su Zuoti looked up at Mo Xiaoyao, who was still sitting beside Yili, and said with gritted teeth, You are so cruel." Looking at the unconscious Su Zuoti, Yili sighed in her heart. If she did not know what kind of person Su Zuoti was, Yili would not be able to help but pity her. Su Zuoti was cruel to herself, but she was also very unlucky. She had miscalculated the degree of cruelty Mo Xiaoyao had towards her. How could the second in line to the throne of the Ding Kingdom, the current prince of the Ding Kingdom, be a kind person who would repay evil with good? Yili did not dare to say that she knew a lot about people like Mo Xiaoyao, but at least she knew a little about him. Love wants one to live, hate wants one to die. If she was Su Zuoti, she would never choose to appear in front of Mo Xiaoyao again in this lifetime. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her face that was stained with blood with some regret and sighed, "I don't know if she will be disfigured." Mo Xiaoyao looked at her with a smile, "Is Lili worried about her?" Chapter 335. Yili glanced at him and said with a cold laugh, "No, this Fae is rejoicing in your misfortune." Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said in understanding, "I understand. Li is jealous. Li, do not worry. In I's eyes, other than Li, there is no other woman at this time." Yili snorted lightly and ignored Mo Xiaoyao. But from the slight curve of her lips, it was possible to see a hint of joy. Mo Xiaoyao sighed inside and pondered how to get Lili to admit that she loved him. Lin Han and Zhuo Jing tactfully retreated to find people to bring the unconscious beauty back to her own courtyard for treatment. Wang Fei had no interest in paying attention to her, and the prince did not seem to be in the mood to pay attention to her. Even though the wound on her forehead did not appear to be life-threatening, but if she was unlucky, there would be one less beauty in the world. The courtyard that Su Zuoti was temporarily living in was a small and remote courtyard in the governor's fu. The governor's fu was not large compared to the residences of the Wang Fu and high officials in Jing. It was very spacious when the governor's family had lived there. But now, the governor of Xinyang City had disappeared. Not only did Mo Xiaoyao and Yili move in, there was also Marquis Nan and the others, as well as most of the high-ranking generals stationed in Xinyang City. This way, Su Zuoti was able to be given a small courtyard in a remote corner of the inner courtyard. It was already preferential treatment. Waking up from her sleep, Su Zuoti reflexively touched her forehead. The thick gauze on her forehead and the clear pain caused her to feel both hate and regret. It was very much like Mo Xiaoyao's heartlessness. She knew very well how powerful Mo Xiaoyao's martial arts were. As long as Mo Xiaoyao did not want her to die, she would not be able to hit the pillar. She regretted her impulsiveness. If she ruined her beauty because of this, thinking about this, Su Zuoti hurriedly got off the bed and leapt towards the bronze mirror on the table. This small courtyard was probably the residence of an unfavored concubine of the governor's residence. Although there was no lack of women's necessities, it was completely different from what Su Zuoti was used to. These items were not exquisite at all. Even the bronze mirror was blurry and indistinct. Suzuki stared for a long time, but all she could see was a blurry shadow on the bronze mirror and a thick white cloth wrapped around her forehead. In a moment of panic, Suzuki reached out to remove the white cloth on her head. "Ah! Miss Bai, you can't undo it." The maid who was serving Suzuki came in from outside and just happened to see her actions. She hurriedly stepped forward to stop her. "Impudent! After living like a princess for so many years, who dared to be so rude to her?" Suzuki snapped. The maidservant was startled and hurriedly said, "The doctor said that young miss must not touch it before the injury is healed. It would be bad if it left a scar." Hearing the girl's words, Suzuki finally calmed down. She stared at her and asked, "You mean there won't be any scars on my face?" The maidservant hesitated, then nodded and said, "As long as Miss Bai recuperates well, it should not be." After receiving the maidservant's repeated affirmation, Suzuki finally relaxed. She sat in front of the bronze mirror and looked at her face in the blurry bronze mirror. She asked, "Who sent me back?" The little maidservant said, "It was Shua Darren and Lin Darren who sent people to send young Miss back." Suzuki's hand paused. "The prince did not come to see me." The maidservant looked at her strangely, but still respectfully replied, "Young miss, the prince did not come." Hearing Suzuki throw the comb in her hand onto the table with a clatter, the little maidservant cautiously took 2 steps back. She was originally a maidservant of the governor's residence. Although she had escaped in the chaos of the war, she had no home to return to. Fortunately, the Wang Fei was kind enough to let her stay in the Fu. She had been sent to serve this beautiful Miss Bai. She had been happy, after all, to be able to see such a beauty was a blessing. But after a few days, she felt that this Miss Bai was very strange. When she heard the Wang Fei call Miss Bai Guifei Bai, even though she didn't know which Guifei she was, she still respectfully called her. But she didn't expect Miss Bai to fly into a rage and insist that she call her Miss Su. But Shua Darren had said that the guest's surname was Bai. So she could only take a step back and call her Miss Bai. And Miss Bai always intimately mentioned the prince from time to time. Even though she was an ignorant maidservant, she could see that the prince's feelings for Miss Bai were not as warm as he was for the Wang Fei. "Damn it! I don't believe that you don't have me in your heart at all." Looking dazedly at the blurry face in the bronze mirror, Suzuki frowned in disgust and said, "Go get a better mirror." Very quickly, Yili and Imo Xiuyao didn't have the mind to pay attention to Suzuki's tantrum, because a shocking piece of news came from Jing. The emperor had thrown the entire Southern Marquis Fu into the prison on the charge of Southern Marquis and Southern Marquis Shitzi for treason. The emperor had already sent people to the border to escort Southern Marquis and Southern Marquis Shitzi back to Jing. Hearing this news, Southern Marquis instantly fell to the ground in shock. He couldn't say a word for a long time. After a long time, he gave a deep sigh. He had been low-key and cautious his entire life, but he hadn't thought that he still couldn't escape the emperor's suspicions. Southern Marquis Shitzi stood and was about to charge out when he was stopped by Yili and Imo Xiuyao at the door. Yili asked, "Where is Shitzi going?" Southern Marquis Shitzi said, "It's all because of my Southern Marquis Fu that has been implicated. I'm going to Jing to ask for forgiveness from the emperor." Before Yili and Imo Xiuyao could speak, Southern Marquis' angry voice came from inside the door, "Unfilial son. Come back here." Looking at the absent-minded Southern Marquis Shitzi, Yili sighed and said, "Let's go back first. Let's hear what the Marquis has to say." Shitzi was impulsive. Southern Marquis Shitzi forced a smile and said, "What kind of Shitzi am right now?" The emperor had thrown the entire Southern Marquis Fu into prison and removed Southern Marquis from his position as Marquis. Southern Marquis Shitzi was no longer Shitzi. Stepping into the reception pavilion, Southern Marquis came forward and cupped his hands, saying, "Prince Wang Fei, I've embarrassed myself." In the past month, Southern Marquis had suffered too many blows. He had been on a long journey and was tired. Even though Southern Marquis Shitzi had gotten better after returning, Southern Marquis Shitzi still looked weak. His originally gray hair was now almost completely white. Yili softly said, "Marquis, take care." Southern Marquis shook his head and forced a smile, saying, "Since ancient times, accompanying the emperor is like accompanying a tiger. Even though I don't want to get involved, I can't avoid." Before he finished, he let out a long sigh. Mo Xiuyao said in a low voice, "I have implicated Marquis Shitzi." To say that Southern Marquis had colluded with the enemy and committed treason, let alone Mo Xiuyao, even Mo Jingqi, who was sitting in the palace, wouldn't believe it. However, Southern Marquis Shitzi had been rescued by the Ding King Fu. In the emperor's eyes, the Southern Marquis Fu and the Ding King Fu were on the same side. Furthermore, all these years, Southern Marquis Shitzi had pretended to be deaf and mute, not helping the emperor deal with the Prince Ding mansion. To the emperor, this was a kind of disloyalty. At this time, the emperor would no longer trust the Southern Marquis Fu. Southern Marquis forced a smile and said, "Prince, why do you say this? This Marquis is cowardly by nature and only wants to stay out of things. If it weren't for I'm afraid I wouldn't be willing to step into this mess. People who try in vain to benefit from both sides, today's retribution is reaping what they sowed." Chapter 336. "Marquis, you don't have to belittle yourself like this." Mo Xiuyao shook his head. When Marquis Nan was young, he also had a time when he was in high spirits. In the following years, the regent Mo Lufang died mysteriously and the previous emperor passed away suddenly. After that, Mo Xiuan also suddenly contracted a disease and tens of thousands of Mahist army perished at the border. Marquis Nan was a smart person. He saw things clearly and thought more. After seeing more and thinking more, he naturally became afraid. That was why Marquis Nan, who did not care about worldly affairs, appeared. Marquis Nan shook his head and did not speak. Yili frowned as she looked at Marquis Nan's gloomy face and his eyes were desolate. She was shocked. Marquis Nan probably had the will to die. "Marquis, as long as you are alive, there is hope. Don't forget that the Nan Marquis estate is still waiting for Marquis Nan's rescue. The heir also needs Marquis Nan's guidance. I hope Marquis Nan will take care." Marquis Nan was startled. He looked at the Nan Marquis heir standing beside him and a determined expression flashed across his face. He said, "This Marquis will return to the capital now. My son. I hope Prince and Princess can take care of him. Marquis Nan, please reconsider." Yili frowned. If Marquis Nan brought the Nan Marquis heir back to the capital, the result might be death, but there was still a chance of survival. But if he left the Nan Marquis heir in the army and returned to the capital alone, he might not be able to return. Marquis Nan raised his hand to stop Yili. He said, "Thank you, Princess, for your good intentions. But, the current emperor, this old man has watched him grow up. Compared to the prince and princess, this old man knows him better. Prince, the Ding royal estate has been loyal to the Dechu state for generations. I shouldn't have said this, but now, there is no difference. As for the emperor, Prince should make plans early." The parlor was silent for a moment. Marquis Nan had already made it clear that returning to the capital was a dead end, but he still wanted to go back. Nan Marquis heir said in a low voice, "Father, I will go back with you." Marquis Nan glared at him. "Nonsense. If I don't return, do you want the Nan family line to end?" "Father." Prince, there are people from the capital. They said they are escorting Marquis Nan and Marquis Nan's son back to the capital. The guard outside reported. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and sneered. I just received the news and the people from the capital have already arrived. Your Majesty has improved. Who is the visitor? The imperial bodyguard replied, replying to Your Majesty, it is the Minister of the Supreme Court, Wang Jingchuan. Mo Xiaoyao frowned. Wang Jingchuan. Prince Ding was busy with a myriad of affairs every day. Naturally he would not have any impression of such a minor character. Marquis Nan smiled bitterly and said, he is Wang Xiaorong's elder brother from the palace, the second legitimate son of the Wang family. Mo Xiaoyao frowned and understood. Although the southern Marquis estate was neutral, it didn't mean that they didn't have any enemies. It just so happened that the Wang family and the southern Marquis estate didn't get along. The emperor had sent such a person to escort Marquis Nan and his son back to the capital. His intention to make things difficult and humiliate them was self-evident. Mo Xiaoyao gave a light snort and said, let him in. Not long after, a young man dressed in the uniform of a third-rank official walked in. This person's appearance could be considered not bad, but there was an air of hostility between his brows that made people feel that he wasn't a good person. Behind him was a young man dressed in the uniform of a seventh-rank official. Yili looked at the person and raised an eyebrow. This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court, Wang Jingchuan, greets the prince, Wang Jingchuan. Wang Jingchuan knew the severity of the situation. After entering, he immediately bowed to Mo Xiaoyao and Yili. The young man behind him also bowed. This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court, Zhou Yu, greets the prince, Wang Jingchuan. Mo Xiaoyao sat in his seat. He looked down at the two people on the ground and said lightly, rise. Why has official Wang come? Wang Jingchuan stood up. His eyes flashed with a trace of pride as he said, reporting to Prince, this official has come under the Emperor's orders to escort the traitors Nan Yi and Nan Junfei back to the capital. Mo Xiaoyao raised an eyebrow, traitors. Marquis Nan is I's deputy commander. Although the Marquis Nan's heir was defeated and captured, he still returned safely. After that, he repeatedly performed meritorious service in battle. Who is the traitor official Wang is talking about? Where is the evidence? Wang Jingchuan clearly didn't expect Mo Xiaoyao to ask such a question. He was stunned for a moment before saying, Prince, this is the Emperor's intention. Could it be that Prince wants to defy the imperial decree? Mo Xiaoyao sneered, defy the imperial decree. Where is the imperial decree? I heard that the Wang family and the Marquis estate have some grudges. I suspect that you are falsifying the imperial decree with the intention of harming the Marquis. Prince. Please be careful with your words. Even if this official has a grudge with the Marquis estate, I wouldn't dare to do such a disgraceful thing. Where is the imperial decree? Mo Xiaoyao asked faintly. Wang Jingchuan choked. Facing Mo Xiaoyao's aggressive gaze, he could only say, the Emperor gave an oral decree. Oral decree. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the uneasy man in front of him with a faint smile and didn't say anything else. Wang Jingchuan lowered his head and stood uneasily in the hall. The entire hall suddenly seemed abnormally quiet. Under Prince Ding's gaze, Wang Jingchuan felt as if he could hear the sound of his heart beating out of his chest. A large patch of the back of his clothes was silently drenched. Just as Wang Jingchuan thought that he would collapse under Prince Ding's pressure, Zhou Yu, who was standing behind him, walked out. He bowed to Mo Xiaoyao and said respectfully, Prince, please calm your anger. This official is just following orders. I ask Prince to make things easier. Following orders. Mo Xiaoyao said with a playful smile. Wang Jingchuan clearly felt Prince Ding's gaze move away from him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Wiping away the fine beads of sweat on his forehead, Wang Jingchuan was even grateful to this somewhat taciturn young subordinate of his. Mo Xiuyao said with a smile, following orders. Originally, I shouldn't have made things difficult for you. However, I'm sure you've heard of a saying. Prince, please guide us. Wang Jingchuan wasn't an idiot. No matter how happy he was that the Marquis estate was unlucky, he didn't care. Since Prince Ding wasn't happy right now, he didn't need to show off his happiness. Of course, the Emperor would definitely stand on his side. However, if Prince Ding were to kill him in a fit of anger, the Emperor was far away and the Wang family wouldn't be able to hold their noses and accept it. Mo Xiuyao looked at the two with a smile and said casually, when a general is away, the Emperor's orders are not to be followed. Wang Jingchuan paused and said with some difficulty, Prince, I have come under orders. Please don't make things difficult for me, Prince. Mo Xiuyao looked at him with an indifferent expression. Wang Jingchuan felt bitter in his heart. He secretly regretted that he had wanted to see his sworn enemy fall and snatched this job. Not to mention that he was just a third-level official, even if it was the first-level Prince Ding, who would dare to say no if he wanted to make things difficult for him. However, if he couldn't bring the Marquis and his son back, his good days would probably come to an end when he returned to the capital. Right now, our army is at war with Xiling. Rashly removing the deputy commander will be detrimental to the army's morale. Official Wang, when you return to the capital, tell the Emperor this. If the Emperor blames you, Official Wang can push the blame to I. Mo Xiuyao clearly had no interest in making things difficult for Wang Jingchuan and said indifferently. Wang Jingchuan shook his head and said, Prince, please forgive me. Marquis Nan's crime of treason cannot be forgiven. The Emperor is already furious. He ordered me to bring the Marquis and his son back to the capital within half a month. Otherwise, I can only take my head to see the Emperor. Prince, please be magnanimous and give me a way out. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly. What a crime of treason. This result, is it the Supreme Court's verdict or the result of the joint investigation of the various ministries? Where is the evidence? Before Wang Jingchuan could figure out how to answer, Shou Yu, who was standing beside him, said, Prince, when the Emperor received the news, he was immediately furious. He ordered us to bring the Marquis back to the capital before interrogating him. Mo Xiuyao snorted lightly. Without interrogating him and without even a decent piece of evidence, the Marquis Nan's entire family had been thrown into prison and executed. He snorted lightly and said, in that case, I was negligent. The Marquis Nan was right next to you, yet you didn't even notice that he was in cahoots with the enemy. Official Wang, why don't you bring a memorial to I asking for forgiveness? As for the Marquis Nan, once the war in the northwest is over, I will personally escort him back to the capital.